This story is about a girl who was very famous in secular circles, who also single-handedly raised her Count's family from its knees. Despite her beauty, people called her the goddess of investment. She was the eldest daughter of the Earl of Eldrin, and she had many secrets that only her closest people knew about. Enchanting blue eyes that sparkled like the endless sea, light ash-colored hair enveloped her, and this lady's name was Inez Eldrin. The action of this interesting story begins with Inez sitting in a chair, who, while carefully studying the latest news in the newspaper, comes across an article in which it is written that the Adre ship sank. Depressed, Inez could not accept this news, because everything happened because of the stupidest situation, since the ship was not even attacked by pirates or it was caught in a storm. No one could have thought that it would catch fire from non-compliance with fire safety rules. Inez gave the order to the servants to urgently prepare the carriage for her trip to the bank, and literally in a couple of minutes, she was already on the road. Sitting in the carriage and looking at all the passing buildings, Inez thought that if she did not want to go bankrupt, then she would have to buy a building in a very good and expensive area. But she was worried that after buying the building, it might also catch fire. Arriving at the bank, she was met at the entrance by an employee who addressed her with great respect and invited her to go inside. The bank visitors there noticed Mistress Eldrin and began to whisper among themselves, discussing the latest news about the sunken ship and how she had recently lost money on everything she had invested in. But despite her beauty and the many nicknames that were given to Eldrin, the most unique thing was the goddess of investment, because no matter what she touched, everything burned out. Unexpectedly for everyone, robbers burst into the bank, shouting in a menacing and threatening voice that no one should move and everyone should remain in their places. Inez looked back at the robbers and began to wonder if a worldwide misfortune had befallen her. First, the loss of a large sum of money, then the sinking of the ship, also her coming of age and talk of marriage. Just the other day, Inez was thinking about what unmarried women need: a reliable family, education, or close friends. It was all wrong, because the correct answer was money. Also, another noble lady who visited Inez a couple of days ago was interested in when the dear lady was going to get married, because if she delayed this matter, she could miss the golden years of her life. Sitting over a cup of tea, listening carefully, and watching the lady who was fanning herself, Inez asked her a question whether she really needed to get married, because after the coming-of-age ceremony, she only heard questions about marriage. Smiling and raising a cup of tea, Inez informed the respected lady that she was now busy making money and did not have time to think about marriage. But in response, she heard that no matter how much money she earned, she would not be able to get married. Especially for such moments, Inez always had a bank statement, which she showed, and after seeing the amount, most of the interlocutors shut up. The embarrassed lady immediately began to praise her beautiful son, telling Inez that she needed a man who knew how to manage money well, and her son was exactly who she needed. But Inez explained to such a distinguished guest that over the years of her investing, she understood one thing: the more money, the better one, and her one ability helped her with this. At each meeting with future partners, Inez Eldrin behaved as befits a respected person, introducing herself and at the same time extending her hand to shake hands. And when she was answered with a mutual handshake, her ability made itself felt. Inez is able to see the misfortunes that will befall other people in the future. Inez could learn about misfortunes not only through handshakes, but also through simple encounters. And thanks to this ability, she always knew how to make the best choice when meeting more people. But when Inez found herself in the bank, her thoughts were that in the morning she had lost her invested money, became a hostage, and all this because the ability had suddenly disappeared a month ago. Sitting next to the young stranger, Inez hoped that her maid Chamor, who remained on the street, had already called for help. All this time, the robbers were looking for bank checks, but to their great regret, they found only some incomprehensible documents. The young man sitting next to Inez said that these were his documents in a completely calm voice, without showing the slightest fear or anxiety. The bank employee approached Madame Eldrin with his apologies and warned the madam that they would take care of her well-being. But the employee's appeal sounded loud enough, and upon hearing the name Eldrin, the robbers were happy because for a representative of this family, they would be able to receive a large ransom amount. While the gang leader was rejoicing and imagining being showered with gold coins, a calm young man suddenly pounced on the robber and carried him off the field like a pawn. Everyone was shocked by this act. It was noticeable that the other robbers hesitated and did not understand what this madman in black was, but without thinking for a long time he dealt with the rest of the raiders. When the problem with the robbers was resolved, the young man asked the bank employee if they could accept his documents now, but he was clearly shocked by the whole situation and replied that now was not the right time. Having overheard the conversation, Inez offered her help to the young man, since he saved her from wasting time while being held hostage. Coming closer to him, Mrs. Inez asked him to go with her to the VIP room, but she was interested in what this man was doing, so she casually took his hand. And at that moment, her ability returned, and she clearly did not expect to see this in her visions. She heard people screaming for help as the owner of the demonic blade went mad. The demonic sword Tigrios, which cut down a sacred tree, was a cursed blade that leads its owner to death. Inez froze looking at him and realized that he was the most famous person in the empire, although not even in the empire but on the continent. The young man looked at the lady while she froze, but after a moment he asked to let go of his hand. At that moment, the knights ran into the bank with an order for everyone to lay down their weapons. But looking back, they realized that they were late, and their captain was standing to the side. Inez, looking at the man in black, realized that this was the unluckiest man in the world whose name was Khalad Azdean. He was also the head of the 3rd detachment of Imperial Knights and the owner of a demonic blade. Following the knights, Shamor ran in fear with only one question whether her mistress was wounded, but Inez reassured her and asked her to wait a minute. Inez ran out into the street after Khaled, but by that moment he had already disappeared. Inez felt her ability return. Following her came Shamor, who was still worried about her mistress and suggested that she see a doctor. Looking back, Inez repeated that she was fine and they needed to visit one more place, since Inez needed to make sure that her ability had returned to her. Having got into the carriage, they went to the hippodrome, where Inez specially stood in the center of the crowd. People who placed bets and walked back and forth accidentally touched Inez, and she saw how people would be shocked after a while by the victory of horse number 6. Already in the evening, sitting in her room, with a glass of red wine in her hand, Inez told Shamor about how she bought 100 tickets for horse number 6, and upon hearing the statement, everyone clicked their tongues. After all, everyone was betting on horses with a high chance of winning, and when they heard about buying 100 tickets, they said that the lady knew nothing about horse racing. But when it was announced that horse number 6 had won, everyone was stunned and couldn't believe it. Their envy was beyond the bounds. When the morning of the next day came, Inez was sitting in her office in a furious state. No one could have thought that the ability would disappear again after appearing only for a day. Inez began to replay yesterday in her head and realized that her ability had returned after touching Khaled Azdean, and she wanted to know more about him. Among many documents, Inez found his biography. He was the eldest son of the Marquis of Azdean and the owner of a demonic sword, the commander of the 3rd detachment of Imperial Knights, single and without a lover. Khaled also came from an orphanage and the Marquis family adopted him, but a couple of years later they acquired their own child. But nevertheless, Khaled is the successor of the Marquis of Azden. According to his colleagues, Khaled Azdean has a bad character and was nicknamed a bloodthirsty killer, but being the owner of such a blade, Khaled will die in a year. Reading more and more, Inez understood that with a fate like Khaled's, it would be a sin not to be a scumbag. There are no ups and downs in life. They will all sooner or later rest in the ground. The story about the demonic sword Tigrios is very old. It was with it that the sacred tree was cut down, and now the sword appears once in a cycle and chooses its owner. The owners become people of different status and nationality, but they have only one thing in common. They lose their minds exactly a year after this sword fell into their hands. After the owner of the sword appears, the paladins are sent out of the temple, and when the time comes, they deliver the owner of the demonic sword to the temple. But each owner has his own time, but among all of them, no one was able to be delivered to the temple. So Khaled Azdean has a limited life. This story passes from generation to generation, and anyone can be its main character. To confirm her guesses, Inez needed to meet with Khaled again, But this was very problematic since his movements consisted only of home and work. But Inez had a brilliant idea that she herself needed to create a reason for the meeting, since she found interesting information from the report. The report indicated that Khalad would visit his favorite gun store every first Wednesday of the month. Without thinking twice, Inez bought a weapons shop that Khalad visits and deliberately waited for him there until the shop workers could not stop admiring the new owner. One of the workers asked the new owner if she needed anything necessary, but Inez answered with a smile on her face that they could calmly go about their business. The workers were delighted with Inez. They warned her that they would be in the forge, and if she suddenly needed anything, she immediately called them. Looking around, Inez understood that these strong men would be awkward at first, but over time, they would get used to her. They were also interested in only one question, whether the new owner would fire them and whether it would be possible for them to leave work on time. Inez reassured them and they went to work with peace of mind, but for herself she realized that the previous owner was even more of a scumbag. While the new owner of the weapons shop was thinking, the door opened, and her expected client, Khalad Azdian, entered. Inez jumped up from her chair and greeted him, adding that she had recently become the new manager of this shop. But without any emotion, Khalad extended his sword with a request to repair it, and Inez needed at least the slightest touch to him. When her ability reappeared, she realized that Khalad Azdian was her luck. At this touch, Inez noticed his failure, which was that he went out early and wanted to eat a special stew, but it was sold out right in front of Khalada's nose. After what she saw, Inez could not understand why they call him a bloodthirsty killer. Taking the sword in her hands, Inez informed Khalad that there was a queue of orders in their shop, and therefore his order would only be completed in 2 days. Inez thought that first they needed to somehow get closer and decided to use that incident from the bank, asking Khalad if it was him, to which she heard a negative answer. Khalad made Inez nervous. She stood silently and tried not to show that something had not gone according to her plan, although she understood perfectly well that she could not be mistaken in the obvious. And then she reminded him that she was the same hostage during the bank robbery and thanked Khalad for saving him, putting the sword aside and taking out her business card. Inez handed it to Khalad with the words that it was not possible then. Taking the business card and putting it under his cloak, Khalad said that he would return for the sword in 2 days, and he turned around and began to leave. Inez was outraged by this. She didn't think that he would just pick up and leave, so she decided that she would not let him go so easily. Having caught up with him, Inez shouted his name. Khalad Azdian slowly stopped and turned to the new owner of the weapons shop. Inez realized that she needed to act right now and offered her help in Khalad's misfortunes. Khalad Azdian looked at Inez and could not understand what her goal was. He asked only one question to her: is it really all for the sake of money? Laughing, Inez warned Khalad that she had plenty of money, but after his words, she began to feel like some kind of terrible person. But this feeling quickly disappeared. Coming closer to him, Inez grabbed Khalad by the cloak and pulled him towards her, saying that he needed to bend over, but he began to resist. Then Inez began to explain that she could tell about the misfortunes that would befall Khalad in the future, and asked him to accept her offer. Khalad escaped from Inez's hands and in a loud voice ordered him to calm down, but Inez, looking into his eyes, said that if he wanted to try that stew, he should come to the establishment 10 minutes earlier than usual. Turning around, Khalad walked towards the exit, and Inez, with a smile on her face, warned that he could come at any time and she would be waiting for him. Near the bench in the carriage, Inez was waiting for her maid Shamor, asking why this young man was so important to her mistress that she even ordered an investigation. Inez immediately explained everything, that for her he was like a goose laying golden eggs. After meeting this young man, Inez's strength returned, although she herself still does not understand why this is happening. After listening to her mistress, Shamor immediately informed her that she would personally take care of Master Khalad. Azdian Inez always liked the straightforwardness of her maid. Shamor was the only person who knew about Inez's ability, with the exception of her maternal grandfathers and younger brother. Inez took her under her wing after Shamor was kicked out of the family, and she became a mercenary. Halfway through the journey, Shamor remembered that there was a letter for her mistress after giving it to Inez. Looking at the envelope, she realized that this was an invitation to the next viewing. Looking out the window and at the small streets, Inez thought about how tired she was of this, because she now needed to earn money, and she didn't understand where to find time for dates. Nevertheless, the more money you have, the better it is for one, but money can attract some parasites. It has always happened to Inez that her business partners impose their relatives on dates, and therefore she thought about finding a groom for cover. But Inez understood that just anyone would not be suitable for this role, and she needed someone who would not be interested in her and who knew how to keep his mouth shut. But he also had to be famous and capable. 3 days passed and Khalad did not show up at the weapons shop. Inez was furious and decided that he needed to be put under more pressure. Her ability was becoming unstable, and Inez realized that she was about to disappear again, and most likely she herself would have to visit Khaled at home. At this time, Shamor was walking into her office with letters for the mistress, and suddenly her gaze fell on a red envelope. It is used for marriage proposals or marriage negotiations. Handing over a stack of envelopes, Inez immediately noticed that Shamor, as always, sorted them according to their importance. Immediately taking the red envelope in her hand, Inez began to look at who was sending it and could not believe her eyes. It was Marquis Asdeon, the Kalada family. Starting to laugh and rejoice at the same time, Inez turned to Shamor to prepare the carriage, since they were going to the bride. Meanwhile, at the estate of the Marquis of Asdeon, preparations were in full swing for the arrival of Inez Eldrin. The servants had to have time to cut roses in the garden, remove dust, and much more. The second son of Marquis Asdeon, Dihat Asdeon, also prepared for his arrival, because it is because of him that all the fuss is happening. When Dihat approached his mother, he immediately asked her whether it was worth inviting Khaled here. But his mother calmed him down and said that they should show a family in which harmony reigns. For Dihat, it was an important day, and he was afraid that Khaled would spoil it. Giving him a contemptuous look, he muttered under his breath that Khalad was a vile bastard. Going out into the street, Marquis Asdeon was already imagining how they would become related to the Eldrin family and gain political influence. And my mother was thinking about a large dowry. Walking closer to her husband, she whispered in his ear that it would be nice to use Inez Eldrin for a political fund, and both of them smiled from ear to ear. Marquis Asdeon added that, according to rumors, Count Eldrin was vacationing outside the city, and his younger brother Inez was studying at the academy. Madame Asdeon was surprised, because it turned out that Lady Eldrin lived alone in a huge mansion. But after thinking a little, she suggested that they could move to the mansion of the Earl of Eldrin, which made her very happy. But Dihat Asdeon proposed another idea, that the dowry could be used to build a new, huge Asdeon mansion. Mrs. Asdeon was even more happy and began to be even more proud of her smart son for such ideas. Standing on the sidelines and hearing all this nonsense, Khaled could no longer be here. His thoughts were about one thing: how tired he was of all this. On the way to the estate of the Marquis Asdeon, Inez began to guess that most likely it was the youngest son, Dihat Asdeon, and most likely he wanted to negotiate her marriage. Inez has always refused to negotiate marriage, without even reading the letters. But then she has the opportunity to meet Khalad, and this time she definitely needs to convince him. As the carriage approached the estate, the servants loudly announced that Lady Inez Eldrin had arrived. Coming out of the carriage, Inez immediately drew attention to Khalad and noticed that he clearly had a bad relationship with his family because he was standing so far away. Inez, looking into Khalad's eyes, noticed that he clearly had no idea that she was coming. At that time, Khaled understood why the name Eldrin seemed familiar to him. Dihat Asdeon appeared in front of Inez, who greeted the guest and expressed great respect for her and was glad to see them. Marquis Asdeon himself also welcomed the lady to his estate. Mrs. Asdeon asked how their dear guest arrived. Inez thanked Dihat Asdeon for the invitation, but their family annoyed her very much because they constantly insisted on marriage, no matter how many times she refused. When Dihat Asdeon took Inez's hand and brought it to his lips, Inez's ability immediately triggered, and she saw how poor Dihat was trying to get over her refusal of the engagement, although it was obvious to her. Marquis Asdeon also introduced his eldest son, whom he believed Lady Inez Eldrin should have heard of. Turning to Khalad, Inez immediately had a smile on her face. She was glad to meet such a famous person. Khalad Asdeon greeted the guest like a gentleman and also kissed Lady Inez Eldrin's hand. When touching Khalad, Inez's ability becomes stronger, and she also saw that he was shocked by the circumstances of his engagement to Inez. Inez shuddered when she saw Khaled's reaction. She did not understand why he was unhappy with the engagement to her. It was like winning the lottery. Having walked inside and sat down at the table, Mistress Asdian immediately began the conversation with questions to Lady Eldrin, because she considered that the arrival was a positive response to the marriage. According to Lady Asdian, her son Dihat is a worthy groom who even composed a song about how he wants to marry the lady. At this time, Khaled calmly drank tea and listened to how Dihat was praised, and the topic of the engagement was touched upon more and more, as well as its date. But Inez, with a serious face, loudly announced that she would like to discuss something first. Since they agreed in opinion, Inez suggested skipping the engagement and going straight to the wedding. Dihat was delighted with this proposal, and if Lady Eldrin would not mind, he would marry her right away. Looking at the pleased Dihat, Inez upset him by saying that she would like to get engaged not to him, but to his brother Khaled. Hearing such a statement, Khaled was shocked. He looked at Lady Eldrin with surprised eyes. It was as if he had fallen into an abyss and heard nothing more than to get engaged to brother Khaled. The story of Khaled Asdian was sad. He was left at the door of an orphanage immediately after birth, and this is where his unhappy life began. He was lucky when he was adopted, but a few years later, his adoptive parents had a son, and as a result, he spent his childhood almost alone. Every day was like a battle. While eating, while walking, even going to bed, he constantly had to be on guard. Over all the years of misfortune, Khaled learned humility, but the only thing that could not let him go was his sword. He really liked fencing. He fought against adversity, blood, and then earned a place in the detachment of Imperial Knights, but misfortune decided to laugh at him. Khaled became the owner of the magic blade by pure chance, after which he was immediately sentenced to a limited life. His fate was predetermined. He was haunted everywhere by looks full of contempt and fear, betrayal from the one he trusted most. In the allotted year of life, he has to accomplish a lot, and one day Khaled accepted this fate. Mrs. Asdian, hearing Lady Eldrin's proposal, was very surprised and laughed embarrassedly. She hoped that she heard it right. But in a confident voice, Inez repeated that she would like to get engaged to Khaled Asdian, the eldest son of the Marquis of Asdian. Without holding back her emotions, Marquis Asdian jumped up from her chair and in a loud, nervous voice began to tell rumors about her eldest son, that he brings misfortune. Inez warned Marquis Asdian that she is aware of these rumors, which is why she wants Khaled to become her fiancé, since she likes misfortune. Everyone at the table sat dumbfounded. They could not even imagine that everything could turn against them like that. And at that time, Lady Eldrin turned to Khaled and asked him to give her a minute of his time. Going out into the garden, Inez noticed that Khaled was keeping his distance from her, as if he was afraid of her. Stopping abruptly and turning around, Inez said that nothing could be changed in this situation, to which Khaled reacted in surprise. Inez asked Khaled why he didn't come to her gun shop, because she was waiting for him, and she was also interested in whether Khaled managed to taste that special stew. Hearing this question, Khaled was shocked, because he was incredibly lucky. Once entering the shop a little early, he got the last stew. Having offered to take a walk and talk, Inez wanted to tell Khaled why she came to him. Inez's most exciting question was whether Khaled had a lover. Having heard this question, Khaled was a little confused. He did not understand why she was asking such things. Noticing that Khaled was embarrassed, Inez offered to think for him, but after that, he immediately replied that he had no one. Inez realized that everything was going according to her plan, and looking into her eyes, invited Khaled Asdian to meet with her. Hearing such a proposal, Khaled was shocked even more. He looked at Inez with an empty and surprised look, not understanding what this lady was even up to. But Inez clarified her proposal a little, saying that they could pretend as if they were dating, because she had no great desire to get married. Looking into Khaled's eyes, Inez explained that everyone wants her to tie the knot, but she doesn't like to live by other people's expectations. That's why she invited Khaled to pretend to be her lover, but he was more interested in why he and no one else. Inez explained this by saying that he had beautiful eyes and that it was her favorite color, but it was not only that, he fit all her criteria. Looking at Khaled, Inez thought that he was not delighted with her, because it would be completely unpleasant if a false lover really fell in love with her. Moving closer to Khaled and extending her hand, Inez said that she could give him what he needed for his normal and peaceful life. When Inez took Khaled's hand, He began to tell her that he had already tried all the methods and means. There was no result. He wanted to understand how Lady Inez would help him, because if she contacted him, then misfortunes would befall her too, and perhaps even death. But Inez was not one of the timid ladies, peering with her bottomless eyes straight into Khalad's soul. She warned him that maybe she was not like everyone else. When evening came and Khalad returned to his chambers, his sword Tigrius began to comment on the past day. Most of all, he liked to look at the upset Dihat. Tigrius also spoke about Lady Inez, that she clearly does not have everything at home, because no one could have thought that she would offer a fictitious relationship, and that she likes misfortune. Listening to all this, Khalad understood that if he had the opportunity to give up the sword, then it would have long ago gathered dust somewhere in a warehouse, because the fact that they could communicate was his big secret. The sword was very interested in whether its owner would accept Lady Inez's proposal, since it would be nice to have a lover and get rid of misfortunes. But Khalad immediately replied that he would refuse. Khalad understood that she was rich and beautiful, and he was the owner of a demonic blade, unhappy and mortally ill. There was no benefit for Inez, and therefore Khalad had suspicions of deception on Inez's part. At the end of the conversation, Inez warned Khalad that she could not wait forever for an answer, and even then, Khalad's sword suspected something. And now, when they were alone, he warned his master that the lady had some kind of ability. The next morning, sitting in her office, Inez, reading the newspaper, was glad that, having regained her ability, albeit temporarily, she managed to conclude several deals, and they began to bear fruit. But then, putting the newspaper aside, Inez thought that several days had already passed since visiting Asdeon's house, and at that time, she had not even planned anything like this. And now, remembering Khalad Asdeon, she understands that there is no better candidate for a false lover than him. He has the appropriate status. He is the eldest son in a family that does not have power. Inez was also pleased by the fact that he was not interested in her. But she was also embarrassed by his reputation, which left much to be desired, and, on top of that, his possession of a demonic blade. Having thought about everything that had happened earlier, Inez understood that, judging by the fact that there was still no answer, Khalad Asdeon was planning to refuse her offer. If this suddenly happens, Inez will explain to Khalad why he will have to accept her offer, because the misfortune that she saw when meeting with Dihat was very interesting. Although Inez understood that once the news spread throughout the capital, Khalad would not be able to refuse her offer. Shamour entered the office. In her hands she held the letters that arrived today. Inez was surprised at such a large number because there were more of them than usual. Shamour explained to Lady Inez that most likely such a large number of letters was due to rumors spreading in the capital, and Inez was very surprised when she heard this. As it turned out, the news had already reached the people that Lady Inez was engaged to the owner of the demonic sword, and everyone began to discuss this. Looking at the stack of letters, Shamour said that she sorted the letters as always, and most of them were asking about the engagement. But taking one letter in her hand and holding it out to Lady Inez, Shamour added that it came from the Count. Inez was surprised and snatched the letter from Shamour's hands, starting to open it quickly and unevenly, because for her it was not just the Count but her beloved grandfather. When Inez began to read the letter, her soul immediately felt warm, and a pink blush appeared on her cheeks. The grandfather was interested in how his granddaughter was doing, and also said that his health had become much better and he would return within a year. After reading the letter from Grandfather Inez, I looked at the remaining letters and asked Shamour if there was a letter from her beloved brother Hilo. Shamour, with a smile on the street, reminded the lady that she received a letter from her brother 2 days ago, but for Inez, it was an eternity. Pleasant memories came flooding back to Inez, because after the death of her mother, it can be considered that Hilo was looking after her, and they began to rely on each other more. Inez told Shamour an old story about how, while walking through the garden with Hilo, he was walking on tiptoe. Inez became worried about her brother and asked why he was walking like that. Hilo, looking into his eyes and without hesitation, answered his sister that he was afraid of accidentally stepping on an ant. Then, Inez realized that her brother was a real angel, who would be very surprised when he learned about the situation that had happened. But she wanted to explain herself in person. Taking the letters from the table, Shamer wanted to tell the lady about the beauty industry market research that she had requested a little earlier. But at that moment, there was a knock on the door and the butler entered, who informed the lady that a message had been received from the academy in which it was written that the young master had gotten into a fight. Hearing this phrase, Ines immediately asked the butler who dared to touch her brother, but he corrected the lady by saying that the young master had beaten his opponent. At that very second, the office door opened and Kylo stood in it, with big, surprised eyes and with only one question: is it true that his sister is getting married? Priscilla's Academy is a very prestigious place, attracting talent from all over the Empire, but even there was one outstanding one, and it was Hilo Eldrin. He scored the highest score upon admission, looks like an angel, a kind fellow from that same Eldrin family. All the students at the academy were discussing Halo, suggesting that only in appearance this guy was kind and had an angelic face. Just 6 months ago, sitting in Ines's office, Hilo told her that he did not want to go to the academy. He was afraid that his friends would tease him for entering the academy late. But Ines warned Hilo that he could just tell her everything and she would sort out the problems. Hilo was also worried about one more thing, that he would have to live in a dormitory, and he could not sleep anywhere except his room. But Ines was ready to resolve this issue, saying that she would arrange everything as in his room. Looking at his sister, Hilo understood that studying at this academy was very expensive, but Ines did not feel sorry for her brother. Even if he had studied all his life, he would not have spent even part of her savings. But now, when Hilo was at the academy and heard rumors that his sister was getting married, and even to the owner of a demonic blade, his state was extremely depressed. Halo wanted to verify everything personally, but he did not have the opportunity to leave the academy since the holidays were far away, and he had spent all his time off. Suddenly, one of the academy students called out to him, holding out an envelope with a request to give it to Madame Ines. Taking the envelope in his hands and looking at his interlocutor, Hilo, with a calm face, asked why he had to hand over this garbage, and who did he even think he was to call his sister by name. The guy was in shock and could not contain his emotions. Raising his voice, he began to explain that he simply asked to deliver the letter, and Halo turned out to be so rude. It was as if Halo was deliberately pulling the guy out, continuing to say that he would not allow such a non-entity like him to get close to his sister. But the guy also decided not to remain silent and began to say that Hilo's character is worse than ever, and he sympathizes with Mrs. Ines that she has such a younger brother. With a distraught look, the guy continued to provoke Hilo, telling him that if he wanted to hit him, then the academy could suspend him for such a thing. Hilo realized that this would be to his advantage and his issue would be resolved by itself. Raising his hand clenched into a fist, Hilo, with a satisfied face, told his interlocutor that he would help him return home and struck. Within a couple of minutes, Hilo was in the director's office, listening to lectures that there was no place for violence within the walls of the academy, and they were forced to send him home to think about his behavior. On the way to Hilo's house, it seemed that these were just rumors. But when he returned to the capital, everyone was talking about it and already standing in front of his sister. He asked if it was true. Ines, looking at her brother, was shocked. How did Hilo find out about the marriage while at the academy? As Hilo explained, rumors have already reached the academy, and everyone is discussing marriage with the owner of the demonic blade. But Ines reassured her brother by telling him that she was planning to have not a husband, but a lover for her own personal purposes. Looking at Hilo, Ines continued to tell him that she did not intend to start a serious relationship, and therefore he could be calm. Hilo understood everything, but for greater confidence he decided to clarify that as soon as his sister's abilities returned, she would immediately break up, and received a positive answer to this question. When Hilo exhaled with relief, he immediately changed his face and decided to apologize to Ines for shouting, because he was emotional after hearing the news. Ines also told Hilo that she could barely restrain herself from going to the academy after she heard that her beloved brother had gotten into a fight. Hilo decided to tell about that guy from the academy who constantly insults their family, but no matter how offended he was, he realized that there was no need to resort to violence. Looking at Hilo, Ines admired him, saying that her brother could not be a bad boy, and in general how such a person could appear in such a terrible world. When Ines realized that Hilo had hit him with his fist, she immediately asked how his hand was and whether it was worth calling a doctor, but her brother reassured her by saying that he had hit him lightly. Having calmed down, Ines asked Halo to just tell her everything next time, and she would settle the problems so that she wouldn't have to use her fists. Hilo listened to his sister and agreed, but suddenly decided to ask a very strange question, whether Ines had problems on the other side. Ines, hearing the question, changed her face and was excited. She understood that on the other side it meant the Marquis Herberet and his new family. She immediately answered that it was not on her part and asked the same question to Hilo, but he also answered that while studying at the academy, they practically never clash. But Ines already had many questions in her mind. Who is trying to get close to Halo? The Marquis Herberet himself, or his father's illegitimate child? Has the free sister really entered the Marquis's family? All these thoughts disappeared after an unexpected knock on the door. Shammer approached and opened the door and informed the lady that a message had arrived from the guards about the jewelry that had been stolen. Ines realized that the bait had been swallowed. She apologized to Hilo and said that she needed to go away for a while to look after her future lover. Standing under a beautiful flowering tree, Khalad looked at the landscape. Suddenly, in the distance, he notices the silhouette of a girl approaching him with a sweet smile on her face. Khalad bursts into a cold sweat and realizes that this is the same dream that has not allowed him to sleep peacefully for many nights. Getting out of bed, he sat down to read the latest newspaper. His sword was glad that the owner had already woken up and decided to invite him to take a walk to that same rich young lady in such good weather. The newspaper only wrote about Ines Eldrin. The sword immediately realized that she was rich enough, and this was a 1-in-a-million chance for its owner. So he began to explain to the owner that this was the best offer, and Khalad would be able to leave the nightly detachment. But Khalad seemed to ignore his charge, only saying out loud that he would soon need to go to work. Getting ready for work and leaving the house, Kalota was called by Madame Asdion. Turning around, he noticed. Behind him stood the upset Mistress Asdeon and the excited Marquis Asdeon. The mistress said that Dihat was in trouble. She explained that recently Dihat had been depressed and started drinking to excess. He met a guy who asked Dihat to provide one favor for 3 gold coins. But when Dihat arrived at the appointed place, he was met by guards, and they asked him to give him a precious stone that had been stolen from the Eldrin family. After listening to the whole story, Khalad said that it was time for him to go to work. But Marquis Asdion interrupted him with the words that they had already sent the man to the imperial palace. Khalad didn't understand anything at first, but then Marquis Asdion added that they took sick leave and asked to take care of Dihat's case. Khalad seemed to have failed after these words. With a mysterious face, Lady Asdion suggested asking Lady Eldrin to be lenient about this situation, since she personally visited Khalad and could listen to him. Khalad turned around abruptly and repeated once again that he was going to work, and he had nothing to do with Lady Eldrin. But after him, the Marquis Asdion and his wife began to speak out indignantly, saying that they did not raise him like that, and that work was really more important to him than family. After this phrase, Khalad understood that only at such moments they are a family, but in life he was never treated as a member of the family. But at the very end, Marquis Asdeon asked Khalad if he really wanted them to kick him out of the family. Khalad understood that if they kicked him out of the family, he would have to leave the Order of the Imperial Knights, in which only representatives of the nobility serve. And if he also refused the post of captain, he would have nothing left at all. Standing deflated, Khalad agreed to try, but did not promise them anything, because he was not sure that Lady Eldrin would listen to him. Getting into the carriage, the sword was indignant all the way at some idiot Dihat, but Khalad only thought that having solved this problem, he would immediately go to work. Arriving at the place, Kalota was immediately met by a guard who demanded that the young man introduce himself, or they would not let him go anywhere. Having taken out his sign of the captain of the Knights of the Imperial Court, Khalod was immediately allowed through, opening the door in front of him where Dikat was located. Dikat was sitting in the little room with handcuffs on his hands. He screamed and asked to take them off, saying that they didn't know who they were dealing with. Entering the room, Dihat immediately noticed Khalad and asked with displeasure whether his parents had sent him, because Dihat was expecting someone more respected, but resignedly ordered Khalad to quickly resolve everything here. Hearing Dihat's order, Khalad reacted with a grin and began to walk into the middle of the room, when suddenly, behind Khalad, a door opened and Lady Eldrin entered, looking very calm. Turning around and noticing Lady Eldrin, Khalad thought that she did not look like someone who had something important and precious stolen from her. But after a couple of minutes, It dawned on Khaled Azdian that it was all a trap, and Lady Eldrin used Dihat to lure Khaled out. When Dihat noticed Lady Eldrin and blushed a little, he greeted her very respectfully. Looking at her guests with her blue-eyed gaze, Inez said that she did not expect and did not think that they would meet exactly like this. Dihat, without listening to her, shouted that he was innocent. Inez began to confront him with the fact that Dihat had come to the scene of a transaction with a stolen item from her family. But Dihat continued to shout that he had been asked for a favor, and he did not know what the item was. In a whisper and covering her face a little with her hand, Inez said that only an idiot in this world would agree to fulfill a request without checking the goods. Lady Eldrin first invited everyone to sit down and discuss the problem that connected them with one thread. Khaled looked at Lady Eldrin with suspicion, and at that time his sword said that this young lady was a very good layer. When everyone was sitting at the negotiating table, Lady Eldrin was the first to speak. She said that the stolen jewelry was worth more than 2 million prul, and when she examined it, she noticed several scratches. Dihat, as if he were that idiot, began to offer his service to Lady Eldrin as payback. He also recalled his feelings for her, and that until now he only thinks about the beautiful Lady Eldrin. When Khaled heard the nonsense that Dihat was talking about, he wanted to slap him on the head, because it was Khaled who felt ashamed for his idiot brother. At this time, Inez looked at Khaled with a very piercing gaze, but Khaled had thoughts and memories of a conversation with Inez running through his head about how she asked him to pretend to be her lover. Dihat, with a distraught look and like the last psychopath, continued to talk about marriage and what a great husband he would be for Lady Eldrin. Khaled could not stand it and ordered Dihat to shut up, explaining to him that such disrespectful behavior is unacceptable, and the thought flashed through his head to punch Dihat so that he would come to his senses. I looked at Khaled with a surprised look. Dihat asked him why he was preventing them from communicating and why the hell should he even listen to some Khaled. These words were the last straw for Khaled. Slamming his fist on the table and raising his voice a little, he announced that he was Lady Eldrin's lover. Hearing these words from Khaled, Dihat was speechless. He looked with such surprised eyes, hoping that this was all a bad dream. Inez was happy at that moment, because Khaled agreed to her proposal, and therefore she explained to Dihat that when they talk to her lover like that, her mood deteriorates. After such words, Dihat looked at Lady Eldrin with a distraught look, and she continued to say that during her visit to the Azdian mansion, she and Khaled decided to date, thinking about engagement. Having come to his senses a little, Dihat was able to utter only one phrase that no agreement had been reached on the topic of engagement. Inez realized that she had nothing more to discuss with Dihat. She got up from her chair and began to leave the room. But suddenly the distraught Dihat began to shout and ask Lady Eldrin to stay at least for a moment. Turning around, Inez said only one phrase, that if something like that happens again, they will meet with him in court, and left. Going out into the street, Khaled also followed her out. He was tormented by only one question. Is it true that Lady Eldrin arranged all this? But Inez had answers to all the questions. She explained that she knew in advance what Dihat was going to do and took advantage of it. Khaled did not really like the answer, or rather, he was interested in one phrase that Lady Eldrin said, namely, she knew in advance. Then Inez had to tell Khaled everything, that she has a special skill and she can see the misfortunes that will happen to the person she touches. Hearing this, Khaled doubted a little, because he could not even think that such an ability existed in the world. Inez teased Khaled, calling him an expert on his abilities and inviting him to tell him a little more about what he might know. Lady Eldrin decided to tell Khaled Azdian her story, that because of this ability, she suffered and her parents did not believe her and stayed away, believing that she would bring them trouble because seeing other people's misfortunes is not normal. After this, Inez decided to live her life alone without getting married. But at her current age, it is difficult to be single, although on the other hand, any man cannot become her lover. When Lady Eldrin told Khaled her secret, she hoped that he would keep it a secret since their fates were similar. Having heard the whole story, Khaled became a little saddened, and now he could not understand whether the conditions offered by Lady Eldrin were too favorable for him. Inez could not admit to him that for her, he was the goose that laid the golden eggs, and even more so, she was not sure that she would finally be returned after contact with Khaled. It started to rain outside. Inez opened her umbrella and, hiding herself and Khaled under it, said that she does not do anything that does not bring money. Also, taking up the umbrella herself, Khaled agreed and told Lady Eldrin that he would become her false lover. At that moment, Shamor appeared behind Inez, who whispered in her mistress's ear that because of this weather she might catch a cold. Without thinking for a long time, Lady Eldrin invited Khaled Azdayan to continue the conversation at her home, where they could discuss all the details. Meanwhile, being in his room, Hilo, in a hysterical state, tried to take out his anger by beating the pillow with his fists, repeating the same thing, why Khaled Azdayan became his sister's lover. Exhausted, Hilo simply collapsed on his bed. He understood that even though it was a fake relationship, he could not understand one thing. Why Azdayan? Because now he had more enemies. Lying face down in the pillow, he talked about how difficult it was for him to protect his sister from that woman and the old man. Almost every day, Hilo remembers rumors and gossip about his father and illegitimate sister. People could not understand how a daughter from a mistress could be older than her own son. And it turned out that their own daughter and son entered the family of Count Eldrin, who was their grandfather. But the problem was that the Count was on the verge of bankruptcy. But things were going well for the Marquis, and his illegitimate daughter gained status and enough money. Also, her father's illegitimate daughter often wrote to Hilo and invited him to be friends, because she was very glad that she had a younger brother, and in each letter she asked not to tell her sister, Ines, about this. But at the moment, Hilo understood that his illegitimate sister, Ronnie Herbert, was not the main problem he wanted to deal with Khaled Azdayan before returning to the academy. Sitting on the bed, Hilo knew that Khaled was the most unlucky man in the world, and he could do anything to his sister. With distraught eyes, Hilo was thinking through a plan to quickly return his sister's strength and force her to quickly part with this guy. The next day, sitting in her office and filling out documents, Inez replayed in her head yesterday's conversation with Khaled, because she didn't think that he would agree to her proposal so easily. But Inez was very happy with his decision, since in another case, she would have had to use blackmail and, moreover, she did not lose money since she had replaced the jewelry with a fake in advance. Inez understood that this would be beneficial to both. She would regain her abilities, and the most unfortunate man in the whole wide world would avoid misfortune they might not make an ideal couple. There was also a very interesting moment for reflection. Inez thought about why Khaled became the heir of the Azdayan house. Even though he is the eldest son, he was adopted, and the Azdayan family is very indifferent to him. Shamer entered the office with very important information for the lady. She finally identified the people who contacted Mr. Hilo. It turned out that among them was Ronnie Herbert, who sent the letter. Hearing this name, Inez's face changed. She was very interested in what purpose Rennie wrote the letter to Hilo. Inez was determined and couldn't wait to meet Ronnie Herbert by any means necessary. But Shamor had prepared for this too. She grabbed an invitation to Countess Bridget, who was hosting a tea party today, because Ronnie Herbert was on the guest list, after which Inez canceled all her plans. At this time, in the house where Miss Bridget lived, a message was received, which was announced by the maid entering the room to the guests and saying that Mrs. Invitation had received a positive response from Mrs. Inez from the house of the Earl of Eldrin. Miss Bridget was shocked and ordered a reply letter to be sent immediately. Meanwhile, Inez was already on her way to the tea party, and looking out the window of the carriage, she thought how much time had flown by since their last meeting with Ronnie. Inez recalled their first meeting, in which Ronnie smiled so innocently, as if she did not know about the circumstances of her parents. She was surprised every minute. Even while sitting at the table, she said that she had never tasted such food. Inez even then understood that Rennie was pretending to be pathetic and playing some kind of game of her own. For Inez, these were very bad memories, since her father stole a lot of money from her mother, and Rennie spent it extravagantly, and when her mother was expelled, her illegitimate sister moved into the mansion and bothered Inez and Hilo. Every time her father gave Ronnie gifts, she thought that Inez also received a gift, but that was not the case. On the way, Shamor informed the mistress that last month Lady Rainey celebrated her coming of age. Inez understood how much time had already passed. Inez recalled her youth, because when she found out that after the expulsion, her mother was ill, she returned under the wing of the Count, and she did not have time to worry about Rainey. Inez had to worry about family and money. Anger and resentment remained in Inez's heart until now she understood perfectly well that time does not heal all wounds. Inez thought for what reason she did not touch Rennie. Obviously, it was not forgiveness. She was just waiting for the moment, but Inez could not even think that Rennie would contact Hilo. And this moment has come when it is worth giving a warning. The guests gathered at Miss Bridges were in full discussion of Mistress Inez and the fact that she would attend today's tea party. When he suddenly opened the door of the hall and Mrs. Inez Eldrin entered, all the guests looked at her with huge, sparkling eyes. When Inez entered the hall, she immediately apologized for being late and greeted all the guests with a sweet smile. Miss Bridges immediately jumped up from her seat. Her excitement was very noticeable. She also greeted Mistress Inez and asked her to come to their table. Inez, coming closer to them, thanked Miss Bridges for the invitation, saying that she was very pleased to read her invitation letter. Rennie, sitting at the table, also greeted her sister with a smile on her face and reminded how long it had been since they had seen each other. Miss Bridges invited her guest to sit next to her because for her this was very important and exciting this evening. Suddenly, Rennie accidentally catches a cup of tea and it flies from the table to the floor, followed by Rennie's sighs and apologies. Excited by the situation, Miss Bridges asked everyone to wait just a minute because the tablecloths and chairs would be replaced immediately. But Inez didn't pay much attention to this whole situation and said that she would sit down opposite Miss Bridges because from this angle, the lady's profile was best seen. After these words, Miss Bridges began to shine like millions of stars in the sky, having already forgotten about this spilled cup of tea. When Miss Bridges sat down in her place, she began to talk about how the next day she had not even thought that Lady Eldrin would join them, and for her it was like a waking dream. Ronnie carefully caught every word she said. The girls also couldn't help themselves and talked about how much they write in the newspapers about Lady Eldrin and how amazing she is. Inez smiled sweetly and listened to how they complimented her one after another about her well-groomed hair, the outfit in which she decided to attend this event today. Ronnie couldn't hold back for long and decided to say that she had also heard a lot about her sister and was very happy for her success and her business that was going uphill. But Ronnie would not be the same if she had not remembered the Audrey ship that sank, reminding her that Inez had invested so much money in it. And at that very moment, Rennie advised Inez to invest in the Tillet ship next time, because her father had invested in it and received a good profit. Calmly listening to all this and sipping tea, Inez said that she never invests huge sums, to which Ronnie reacted very emotionally, because according to her information, 5 million prules were invested in the ship. Inez told Lady Rainey that she had already forgotten about it until she reminded her, and 5 million is not such a big amount. Rennie, trying to squeeze out a sweet smile, asked Inez to address her simply as Rennie, because the lady's address was too cruel for her sister, and they were members of the same family. Hearing this, Inez immediately said that they were not members of the same family, and she never had a sister or a father. After such a statement, Rainey jumped up from her seat and warned Inez that if her father heard this, he would be very upset, but Inez once again repeated for Lady Rainey that the Marquis Herbert was a stranger to her. Lady Inez also added that Marquis Herberti was deprived of parental rights due to non-payment of child support, as he claimed that he had nothing to pay. Ronnie felt very embarrassed because her sister was humiliating her father in front of other girls. Lady Ronnie's feelings were greatly affected, and therefore, she confronted Lady Eldrin that she was speaking too harshly of her father. But Inez, quietly drinking tea, continued to explain to Lady Rainey that the Marquis Herberti was not her father, since even animals take care of their young, and Inez could not consider someone who is worse than an animal to be a father. Lowering her head and looking innocent, Lady Rainey said in a very sad voice that she just wanted to be friends with the family members, even though she had a different mother. Listening to all this nonsense, Lady Eldrin remembered how Lady Ronnie is trying to contact Hilo without her knowledge. She clearly wants to have a younger brother who looks like an angel, because Ronnie is used to taking all the best for herself. After Inez thought about Hilo, she became very wary, because she could not allow Lady Rainey to play with him like a doll. Standing up and walking over to Lady Ronnie, Inez put her hand on her shoulder and warned her that if she wanted to play family, she should go elsewhere. Leaning closer to her face, Inez whispered in her ear that if she suddenly found out about Halo's next letters, she was afraid to even think what she would do to Lady Rainey. Then turning to Miss Breeches, Lady Eldrin apologized and informed her that due to the situation, she needed to be the first to leave the event. With a very sweet and good-natured smile on her face, Inez thanked Lady Breeches for the incredibly delicious tea and in return invited her to visit her. Hearing the praise and return invitation from Lady Eldrin, Miss Bridges was completely delighted and was already looking forward to the meeting. Getting ready to leave and saying goodbye to the other ladies, Inez looked at Lady Rainey again, because she already knew what would happen to her in the future. During the conversation, placing her hand on Lady Rainey's shoulder, Inez saw a rather amusing misfortune in which Rainey said that she wanted exactly the dress that she did not get. When Khaled was sleeping, he again had the same dream that he had been dreaming for a long time. Suddenly waking up, Khaled had tears rolling down his cheeks, and he realized that in this dream he was constantly waiting alone for a person he didn't even know. And when he woke up after this dream, he always cried. All thoughts of Kaloda were interrupted by the sword with his question about whether his owner would meet with that same lady today. Khaled thought about it, because Inez asked him to come see her when he had free time, and today was his day off. But Khaled still didn't trust her and treated her with caution. Having gathered and gone to the house of Lady Eldrin, at the entrance to it, Khaled examined this large white house, and his sword warned him that he should not miss such a girl. Having arrived at our place, the sword explained to the owner that this was paradise for them, and offered to stay with this sweet and very smart lady for her age. Coming out of the carriage, Khaled asked his sword to shut up, and going out into the street, making a bow, Khaled said that he had come to Lady Eldrin. But on the porch of the house, Kaloda met Hilo with a very serious face. He informed Mr. Kaloda Azdeon that his sister had left. Without hesitation, Khaled said that in this case he would stop by next time. But Hilo was very serious. Heading towards the entrance of the house, he invited the master to chat and drink tea until his sister returned. Khaled looked at Hilo and understood that brother and sister are birds of a feather because they don't listen to anyone. Entering the hall and sitting down to drink the offered tea, Khaled took a sip and realized that he was drinking salty black tea. Had the servant confused sugar with salt, he thought, and continued drinking. All this was observed by a serious Hilo, who could not understand why Khaled Azdeon was silent and did not say anything. As it turned out, Hilo deliberately added salt instead of sugar, but Khaled understood that worse things had happened to him than this little misunderstanding. Hilo began the first conversation by asking Mr. Khaled if he knew what a popular person his sisters were, and that difficulties could arise if they pretended to be lovers, and then accidentally fell in love. In a very calm voice, Khaled answered the young master that this would never happen. But Hilo jumped up from the sofa and, beating his chest with his hand, shouted that he would always be in first place. When suddenly he heard a question behind him. What were they doing here? Turning around, he noticed his sister, who had already come home after some important business. A pleased Inez praised Hilo for entertaining the guests while she was away. Inez, looking at Khaled, clarified the fact that she has a very cute little brother and asked Hilo to return to her room and rest. Sitting opposite Khaled, Inez admitted to him that she did not expect such a quick meeting, and when she found out about the unofficial meeting with Hilo, she immediately returned, abandoning all her affairs. Khaled informed Lady Eldrin that he had sent a letter in advance in which he wrote about his arrival, but then he thought that the lady most likely had some problems because he had received a letter in response. Despite all these minor problems, Inez was glad that Khaled had arrived and offered to discuss what they could not talk about before, placing some documents on the table. She wanted to clarify some points, and therefore provided Khaled with a contract in which it was written that Inez Eldrin and Khaled Azdeon would enter into a contract and become a couple. The contract would last for 1 year. Holding this contract in his hands and reading it over and over again, Khaled was a little confused. He reminded Inez that a year might not pass. But Inez calmed him down and explained that for now they would stop at 1 year, and if neither party died, then they would extend the contract. Then Inez decided to list the subclauses of this contract, which were that during the contract they are prohibited from having other lovers. Everyone does everything possible to make the relationship appear. Inez Eldrin takes on all the costs, and Khaled Azdeon protects Inez from other men. Inez also prescribed one of the equally important points, that physical contact is possible only by mutual consent, and holding hands is possible without prior consent. The most important and final point was that it is forbidden to have feelings for each other, and looking with her bottomless eyes, Inez told Khaled not to fall in love with her. After listening to all the points and understanding them, Khaled told Inez with complete confidence that he promised to comply with them. I extended my pen to Khaled. Inez asked if he wanted to add anything to this list, and if he agreed, he could sign it. But suddenly, when Khaled took the pen from Inez, he accidentally touched it, and then her abilities worked. Inez was shocked by what she saw, because she learned that her goose would die in a week. All this should happen in his own bedroom. When Khaled is sleeping, the killers will break into him and do their terrible deed. Inez couldn't believe that nothing had started yet, but it could end so quickly. Khaled noticed that something was wrong with the lady and decided to ask what happened. After a few minutes of silence, Inez told Khaled the misfortune that would happen to him, that in a week the killers would enter his bedroom. Being in a state of shock, Inez, without noticing, dropped her pen. But Khaled didn't even raise an eyebrow at what he heard. He only replied that this often happens to him. Looking at Khaled with wide eyes, Inez could not understand whether the killers had already attacked him. He then admitted to Inez that after he became the owner of the demonic sword, the number of threats increased, and he thought that Igfrid's followers were involved. Inez had never heard this before, so she was interested in listening. What is Igfril? Then Khaled began a story about the deity that most countries on the continent worship. It was the power of the high priest and the great temple, as well as the divine power that could be seen with your own eyes. This gift Igfrid gave to the earth, the divine tree. This tree was very huge. It seemed to touch the sky, and its roots stretched across all the lands of the continent. The sacred tree was the embodiment of life, something that shared the fate of the peoples of the continent. But one day, the demonic sword Tigrios damaged the tree. After Khaled's story, Inez understood her visions and why everyone was trying to kill him, because when his death came, he would feel relief. But she was worried about another question, why the temple did not take him. But Inez decided for herself that until she fully regained her ability, Khaled would not be able to die, even if she really wanted to, and decided to tell him that nothing would happen to him. Khaled was surprised because he thought that after his story Inez would change her mind. He reminded her once again that if she continued to hang out with him, sooner or later she would be in danger. Grinning a little, Inez said that if she was in danger, then so was the empire, since the economy of the empire would collapse and the country would be in a very uncomfortable position. In just a short time, Inez had already come up with about 10 ways to stop the killers and invited Khaled to listen to them. Piercing Lady Eldrin with his gaze, Khaled was already talking about his bad reputation, and it was because of him that Inez would also hear something bad addressed to her. But Inez hastened to reassure Khaled by the fact that many people spoke badly about her, and this has not been a problem for her for a long time. Then, having calmed down a little from her visions, Inez explained that it was impossible to please everyone, and, moreover, no one else was talked about as much as they were about her. Inez, with her bottomless blue eyes, looked into Khaled's eyes, which burned with a hot fire, and asked if he had any more questions, to which she heard a negative answer. And now, with full confidence, Inez offered to sign the papers. Khaled, picking up his pen from the floor, left his autograph under all the listed points of the contract. Immediately after signing the contract, Inez suggested that her lover buy rings in order to appear like a real couple to others. When they arrived at the jewelry store, for some reason it was only there that Khaled wondered if it was too early for rings, but Lady Eldrin reminded them that in order not to arouse suspicion, they would have to buy them. Inez admitted to Khaled that for other people their relationship may seem like a surprise and cause a lot of negativity. Looking at Khaled with a sweet glance, Inez asked how he was doing with acting, to which he replied that he had never tried this type of activity. She noticed some excitement in his eyes and suggested that he just repeat after her and everything would work out, because they couldn't act like strangers while going for the rings. Entering the jewelry store, all the consultants immediately ran to the beautiful couple and greeted them. The girl with a smile on her face noticed that Mrs. Eldrin had not looked into their store for a long time and immediately asked what she could tell them. The prompt Mistress Eldrin replied that she would like to look at the rings, or to be more precise, wedding rings. The expression on the girl's face immediately changed. She decided to clarify again whether she had heard anything about wedding rings. But pressing even closer to Khaled, Inez repeated that they needed paired rings. The the quality of which this sweet girl should have taken care of. Then the girl immediately offered to look at their new collection, asking to follow her. Approaching the display case with rings, the girl told and showed the very models that were made quite recently and which are popular at this time. While looking at the rings, Khaled noticed a very interesting ring from a very famous jeweler. Leaning closer to the display case and looking at it even better, Khaled suddenly heard his sword, which said that this particular diamond ring should be taken, because even if its owner breaks up with this lady, the ring will remain for him, and diamonds cost a lot of money. Closing his eyes and being patient, Khaled thought in his head about how it would be nice to sell the demonic sword to some flea dealer and buy a ring with the proceeds. But his internal state was suddenly interrupted by Inez, who asked his opinion about the ring, pointing to the same one with a bunch of diamonds that Khaled had been looking at a few minutes ago. When Khaled replied that this was a good option, Inez immediately took the ring and began to put it on Khaled's ring finger. Taking the second ring, Khaled also put it on Inez's finger. At that moment, she watched everything that was happening with a very sweet look. While filling out the documents, the girl said that they could make an engraving on the inside of the ring. Inez liked this idea, agreeing. She began to dictate her first and last name, and then her chosen one. But when she heard the name Khaled Azdian, the girl immediately became nervous. Looking at the girl, Inez asked her if any difficulties had arisen. But the shocked girl replied that everything was fine and asked to wait for the master and mistress, and they would do the engraving right away. Sitting down on the sofa, they were served drinks. Inez, looking at Khaled, asked him to try the drink. Without asking a single question, Khaled silently took the glass and began to taste the contents, but after taking a small sip, his face changed. All this time, Inez watched him with very great interest, and noticing his first sip, she thought that Khaled would put the glass back, but most likely he liked the contents. Taking her glass in her hand and starting to drink, Inez knew that this was ordinary apple juice, and if Khaled continued to drink it, then he liked apples. After finishing the juice and sitting a little longer, a girl with rings approached them and said that the engraving was ready and they could pick up their order. Having put the rings back on each other, Inez and Khaled headed to the exit, and all the consultants bowed to such important customers, thanking them for choosing their store. Just before leaving the store, Inez whispered to Khaled that journalists were waiting for them outside, and when they left, he would have to put his arm around her shoulder. Khaled listened to all of Inez's demands, and when they left the jewelry store, he immediately put his arm around her shoulder, because his ring could be seen much better this way. Touchingly, Inez also showed her hand with the ring, thinking to herself that now the whole empire should know about it. The journalists were shocked by what they saw. They tried to write down every word said by Khaled Azdian and Inez Eldrin. Meanwhile, Emperor Karais Gerald Benezian was at home drinking tea, looking in front of him at the empty sofa. There was another cup of tea on the table, or more precisely, her favorite magnolia tea. Looking at all this, Karais remembered her appearance and her sweet smile like a child's. He heard her tenderly and lovingly pronouncing his name. When the butler entered the room, Karais inquired about the crown prince, to which he heard in response that he had gone hunting. The butler also decided to tell about new rumors in which they say that the eldest daughter of the Eldrin clan intends to get engaged to the owner of the demonic blade. But as it turned out, the emperor heard about these rumors in the morning, and was a little shocked that a family that in just a few years had gone from disgrace to shocking the entire empire. Although he was more shocked that the chosen one was the owner of the demonic blade, Karais remembered the very day when everything happened. That day, the butler burst into the meeting room with the news that the owner of the demonic blade had been chosen. Karais at that moment was in complete peace and was waiting for what the butler would say next. He began to say that the sword that appeared for the first time in 100 years was chosen as its owner by a member of the Order of Imperial Knights. Suddenly, after hearing the information, one of the members of the meeting hit the table with his fist and asked in an indignant voice how it happened that the owner of the demonic sword was a member of the Order of Imperial Knights. He was furious because they could not trust the protection of the imperial family to the one chosen by the cursed blade, so he offered only one option, which sounded like exile. But other members of the meeting also rose to defend Khaled Azdian, saying that he would not leave the Order of the Imperial Knights, and this had already been decided. But no one could understand who made such a strange decision, when suddenly it turned out that the high priest had decided so. Someone suggested that Khalad Asdian remain in the order, but if something happens, the temple will take responsibility. But still, someone was very worried about this, and with all their dissatisfaction, they said that if all the responsibility falls on the temple, they cannot refuse the request of the high priest, and they transferred Khalad from vice captain of the 1st detachment to captain of the 3rd detachment. Finishing his tea and replaying the whole story in his head, Karais understood that this was all done for his safety, since the 3rd detachment operates outside the imperial palace. Looking at the picture that hung on the wall, Karais understood that everything happened because of his curiosity. At that time, Inez, sitting in her office, admired the new decoration on her hand, thinking that she finally got what she wanted. After several days have passed and the entire capital has been turned upside down by the news, the newspapers are still full of articles about the relationship between Inez Eldrin and Khalad Asdian. Inez estimated that in about a year, Khalad would be taken to the temple, and after that she would not marry for at least several years, because she would become a grieving widow. But the big mystery for Inez remained the fact why the temple gives the owner of the demonic sword a reprieve, because sooner or later misfortune will befall him. For Inez, the most important thing was to regain her strength, but for this, she still needed to maintain contact with Khalad and hold on to him until the last. A slightly agitated Shamer came into the office with a tray in her hands, on which lay an envelope with green frozen sealing wax. Remembering that this month was the Emperor's birthday, Inez reached out to the envelope and accidentally touched Shamor's hand. And then Inez saw how Shamor was indignant towards some potato head. There was also useful information that Inez learned that the mine would become unprofitable. After everything she saw, Inez looked at Shamor with a very sweet and kind look. She realized that Shamor also rushes from one extreme to another and is the only one who treats Inez so well. Without thinking for a long time, Inez ordered Shamor to get rid of the mines in the south. A little taken aback, Shamor reminded the lady that negotiations in this direction had progressed greatly. With a pleased face, Inez said that this was a bad investment and warned Shamor that she would be away for a while. When the carriage was ready, Inez went to meet Khalad. She wanted to inform him of the impending misfortunes, but there were only 3 days left until the day of his death. Approaching the meeting place, Inez thought over her plan, for which everything was already ready, because no one could encroach on her goose. Coming out of the carriage, Inez saw Khalad, who was wet from head to toe, but rain was not forecast at that time. Coming closer to Khalad, she clarified what happened to him while trying to style his hair. He said that on the way to a meeting, someone poured water on him. Having calmed down that nothing serious had happened, Inez suggested that Khalad first change clothes, and they headed towards the store. Inez decided to check with Khalad how his last few days had gone. As it turned out, she did not see that he would be doused. Suddenly, Inez pulls Khalad closer to her, and a huge vase of flowers falls from the upper floors. Excited, Inez asked if everything was okay and if he was hurt, but in her head she understood that he could have died before the attack of the killers. Looking around, Inez accidentally put her hand on Khalad's chest and learned that after their trip to the store, there would be a fire. Then Inez understood why they call him the unluckiest man in the world, because a pot of flowers almost fell on his head, the road was closed for repairs, and in addition, he was almost run over by a loaded cart. Khalad offered to finish all the plans for now, but Inez was serious and warned him that if he went alone, he might fall under the wheels of some carriage. When they got to the store, Inez quickly packed a couple of suits, because as long as the store didn't catch fire, everything would be fine. Having given Khalad's things, Inez warned him that she would be waiting for him outside, and he should quickly change clothes and go out. While waiting near the door of the fitting room, Shamer whispered to the mistress that she did not expect him to be such an unlucky person, because with such success, her mistress could be in danger. But Inez told Shamor that she was ready for something like this. She was just surprised why what was happening went beyond her imagination. Looking back at the fitting room door, Inez thought about how nice it would be if they could choose the misfortunes that would fall on their heads. Then, abruptly approaching the fitting room, Inez began to worry why he had not come out for so long. She began knocking and asking Khalad if everything was okay. Having not heard an answer, Inez ordered Shamer to bring a hammer, but after this phrase, Khalad replied that he had a small problem. Inez immediately began to receive a lot of questions about what happened. Opening the fitting room door and looking out from behind it, Khalad reported that his buttons had come off. Looking at Khaled, Inez realized what a beautiful, pumped-up body he had. The girls' consultants were shocked to see such a handsome man. Noticing this, Inez immediately approached Khaled and reminded him that in this form he could only appear in front of her. Having given Khaled a new shirt and holding the door of the fitting room, a little embarrassed, Inez asked the girls to count them. When the girl reported the amount, Inez wrote out a check for a larger amount than it was in the end. Looking at the mistress, the girl understood that these were very dear customers of their store. Having gotten ready and leaving the fitting room, Khaled looked stunning. The suit that Inez had chosen for him was perfect. Looking at Khaled and biting her lower lip a little, Inez realized that she had the most beautiful goose in the world. Inez also had plans to change Khaled's hairstyle, but there was no rush. As they got ready to leave, the girls in the store began to rush around and scream that there was a fire at the entrance to the store. When Khaled and Inez found themselves on the street, people had already begun to whisper about the fire. Someone said that it was caused by a lightning strike on the store sign. Looking at the sky, Inez did not notice a single cloud or any sign of lightning. Then Inez realized that her ability to foresee the misfortunes of others was not omnipotent, and she could not see what did not make another person feel unhappy, and she also could not control phenomena such as lightning. Drawing conclusions from everything that was happening, Inez realized that Khaled could die or be injured as a result of a natural disaster. Behind Inez stood an upset Khaled, who informed her that the fire was most likely caused by him, warning her that if luck was not on Inez's side, she could get hurt. Khaled asked her only one question about whether she still wanted to be his lover, but Inez, looking into his eyes, replied that lightning could strike on any other day. Khaled asked her if she really thought that this was all a coincidence. Inez was sure of this and was outraged that Khaled always blamed himself for everything that happened, although it was a real coincidence. Then Inez realized that every time something like this happened, people blamed Khaled for everything, because it was much easier for them. Turning away from him, she ventured to suggest that this could have happened because of her, because lately she had been unlucky, citing an example about a ship in which Inez had invested a large sum of money sank. But a fire broke out while cooking. Then Inez, taking Khaled by the arm, suggested that he change the situation and not be so gloomy. Walking and continuing to hold Khaled's hand, Inez saw that he still had not been able to try that same apple pie, although he had visited this bakery several times already. With an intriguing look and addressing him as Sir Khaled, Inez asked if he liked apple pies. Without any enthusiasm, Khaled replied that he didn't really like them but would like to try them. Then Inez told Khaled that they sell delicious apple pies on 12th Street, and you can walk there and have a snack. After another couple of hours, Inez returned to her home late in the evening where Hilo was waiting for her. Coming out of the carriage, Hilo immediately asked if his sister had a good time. With a smile on her face, Inez replied that everything went well. Satisfied, Hilo calmed down after his sister's answer and said that he would come to her on vacation, after which Inez stroked his head. But when Inez removed her hand, Hilo noticed the ring that shone on his sister's finger, and his face changed. Noticing this, Inez became worried and thought that her brother was not feeling well. But Hilo said that he was worried that he could not greet the guest properly. Leaning against Hilo's forehead, Inez reassured him and said that next time everything would work out and he shouldn't worry about it. In a good mood, Hilo sat comfortably in the carriage, waving his hand through the window and shouting to Inez that he would soon return to her. In response, Inez also waved her hand at Hilo and told Shamor what a cute little brother she had, to which Shamor replied that the young master was indeed very nice. But Shamor's thoughts were that her mistress would never know that her brother became an angel only with her. When Hilo left, Inez's gaze fell on the garden, and then she invited Shamor to drink tea there, because there had not been such beautiful evenings in the garden for a long time. Shamor immediately went to prepare everything for tea, and Inez decided to take a walk in the evening garden, remembering her mother and how happy she would be to see such support. Inez seemed to return for a moment to that very day, when sitting by her mother's bed, she told her that lately she had been taking care of everything herself, and when her mother felt better, they would take a walk in the garden together. Little Inez promised her mother that she would not have to walk through the garden overgrown with weeds, and that the flowers would bloom very soon, so she asked her mother to open her eyes. Every time she remembers that day, Inez thinks that if she had gained her ability earlier, her mother would be sitting next to her now. Inez felt guilty and promised herself that she would succeed at any cost without fear or doubt. She decided to use her power to protect those she loves and who are dear to her. While Inez was walking, Shamor had already prepared everything and called her mistress to the table, on which there was not only tea but also apple jam and pie. Having eaten this apple jam, Inez remembered Khalad at the establishment where they tried the apple pie that he had wanted to try for so long. Having tasted just one piece, Inez offered to pack the pie herself, to which Khalad agreed, and then he looked like a cat who had grabbed the desired fish. Sitting in the garden, Inez replayed the day when they went for rings. Khalad then drank apple juice well, which means he likes apples, Inez thought. Thinking that a week has already passed since they entered into a fictitious relationship, Khalad still has doubts and keeps his distance. This may be because Inez perceives him as a goose and not a man. That day, over apple pie, Inez brought up the topic of a murder that was going to happen in a few days. Then Inez asked Khalad to do as she asked, because Inez promised him that his hands would not get dirty with blood. And sitting in the garden, Inez understood that today was the day when Khalad should be attacked. Heading towards the house, Khalad recalled Inez's demands that, after work, he needed to go straight home, refuse dinner, and behave as usual, so that no one would suspect anything. Khalad thought about the first date on which nothing serious happened. Because he himself was not hurt or caused any damage, he was even able to try the apple pie that he had wanted for so long. For the first time in his life, Khalad felt so calm. He wanted everything to be this way, but he couldn't wish for much. Arriving at the house and getting out of the carriage, thoughts of a wonderful, calm evening did not leave him, because Khalad's body would soon be taken to the temple, and that would all be over. From all these experiences, Khalad spontaneously began to twist the ring on his finger, and then he remembered the enchanting blue eyes that sparkled like an endless sea, the light ash-colored hair that enveloped Inez. Khalad thought that Inez would start asking him for something as soon as they entered into a fictitious relationship, but nothing of the kind happened. Even despite the misfortunes that happened to him, Inez did not run away from him. Approaching the doors of his chambers, Khalad began to think that he simply did not know how exactly they were using it. Having made himself comfortable in the chair, Khalad was served dinner, which Inez asked him to refuse. Without thinking for a long time and taking the plate, Khalad threw the dinner from the balcony into the garden, then left the dishes outside and completed his evening chores as usual. Inez's next order was for Khalad to lie down to rest and put his sword nearby, just in case. Literally a moment later, the assassins burst into the room, shocked that Khalad Azdian was not sleeping. They were warned that Khalad Azdian would be given sleeping pills during dinner, but apparently someone made a mistake. The leader of the gang calmed his charges and told them that no matter the owner of the demonic blade or not, Khalad Azdian was an ordinary person. Raising his sword and shouting to Khalad Azdian to die, she began to attack. Suddenly, at that moment, 4 more people with swords and in masks appeared in the room. Stopping, the main killer asked the others why they had come. Did they also want to kill the owner of the demonic blade, but since they came first, they will do it. But the leader of the 4 said that it didn't matter to them who was first, because his goal was completely different. With a swing of his sword, he cut the throat of one of the killers. Looking at all this, Khalad could not understand what was happening. The sword asked the owner why they were fighting among themselves. After 2 minutes, all the killers were disarmed and killed. The leader of the 4 came closer to Khalad and said that he could sleep peacefully because they would clean up after themselves. Khalad's hand still held the sword, who had many questions for the owner. Where did the killers of killers come from? Khalad looked at them and could only ask who sent them, to which he heard the very expected answer that it was Mistress Eldrin. And only then did he remember her words that she would take care not to get his hands dirty with blood. The next day, Inez had already completed a single transaction from which she received quite a lot of profit. Lately, Inez began to feel that her abilities had become stronger than before, and the area of misfortunes that she could see had increased. But she still hasn't figured out how to maintain her abilities without Khalad. But when she saved the life of her goose, there was enough time to think about this topic. Approaching the carriage, Inez asked Shamor what her schedule was. Shamor reminded her that the lady was having lunch with Duchess Helios today. Having got into the carriage and gone further on business, Shamor asked the lady if she would be present at the banquet on the occasion of His Majesty's birthday. With a mysterious smile, Inez thought about attending this evening with her partner, because there is no better place to provide Khaled than the imperial palace. Looking at the ring, Inez came up with a brilliant plan that when she introduced Khaled, she would no longer have to bother with explanations. But when Inez goes to the banquet, she will meet people she doesn't usually see and wouldn't like to see. Inez asked Shamer if her dress from the Ruby Sanon salon was ready, to which she heard the answer that it would be finished soon. Delighted with what she heard, Inez thought about rewarding the salon employees for their hard work. Meanwhile, Rainey Herbert, celebrating her birthday, listened to compliments from guests about her necklace, which her father brought her as a gift. Listening to Lady Rainey's praise, she remembered that very tea party when Inez said nasty things to her, and no one took her side. Even after Inez left, everyone treated Lady Rainey as if she was not there. While all the girls were talking and laughing, Lady Rani was in her thoughts. She had to make sure that there were people on her side too. When Lady Rani was given gifts and compliments, she understood that everyone who was at the holiday loved her and was also on her side. But clenching her fist so tightly, Rainey wished that Inez would also feel the shame and humiliation that she experienced that day. Rani also remembered that several years ago, they all lived together in the Marquise's residence. But when their mother fell ill, Hilo was taken away, and Rani was sad that she could not contact him. And when she succeeded, Inez humiliated her in front of all the girls and, on top of everything else, she also tried to threaten her. Rennie did not understand why Inez so limited her communication with her younger brother, most likely. Inez was afraid that Rennie would become closer to Hilo, because Inez's jealousy was still there when she was jealous of Rennie's father. Having thought about all this, Rennie decided to return to the conversation with the girls. They were already discussing Mistress Eldrin, who should become engaged to the owner of the demonic sword. But suddenly, the topic changed sharply, and the girls were already asking Lady Rani whether she would attend a banquet in the Imperial Palace, to which they heard a positive answer. The girls were very interested to know whether Lady Rani had chosen a dress for herself, but she told them that she was looking at fashion houses. The other girls were discussing Ruby Sanon's house. As it turned out, almost no one was allowed there, and they would all like to wear her dress at least once in their lives. Hearing about this, Lady Rani was very surprised, because she could not even think that it was so difficult to book a place in this fashionable house. Hearing this, all the guests immediately thought that Lady Rani had ordered her dress there, and envying her, they asked to take them the next time she was there. As it turned out, Lady Rani had to beg her mother and father for a very long time in order to get the opportunity to get to Ruby Sanon. When their gatherings ended and Lady Rani saw off her guests, she thought that she had only received permission from her parents, but had not yet made an order. Getting into the carriage, Lady Rani asked to be taken to the fashionable house of Ruby Sanon. She is the only daughter of the Marquis Herbert, and if she doubles the price, they will definitely accept her order. On the way to the fashionable house, Rennie thought about the rumors about the engagement of Inez and the owner of the demonic blade. She perfectly understood that these were just rumors, because her half-sister was proud and vain. She would marry an old man with money and status. Arriving at the fashion house, Ronnie noticed that it was closed and was a little upset. Getting out of the carriage and approaching the girl at the entrance, Ronnie told her that she had arrived here to order a dress for the banquet, but in response she heard that the fashion house was no longer accepting orders. Then Ronnie decided to act differently, starting to say that she was from the Herbert family and her order was very important. But the girl at the entrance apologized and explained to the lady that now they are forced to refuse even His Majesty the Emperor. Ronnie began to get angry and say that they should cancel other orders and accept her because she would pay several times more, but she heard a negative answer. Then Rennie pushed the girl away and began to enter the fashion house, and in her head there were thoughts that she had already boasted to other girls, but in the end she could not order a dress. Before her shone a dazzlingly beautiful dress that she could only dream of. Pointing to it, Rennie said that she was buying this particular dress, but the girl told her that this dress was not for sale because it was made to order. Rennie shouted at the entire fashion house that she would pay very well for it, or would personally talk to the customer herself, demanding the girl's name. The girl told Lady Rainey that this beautiful dress was custom-made for Mistress Inez Eldrin. Rainey's face changed. She understood that this dress cost as much as a whole set, and she would not be able to afford it. Looking at this dress, at such delicate work, Rani asked to call the designer right away. but the girl explained that Madame Eldrin had sent all the house employees on vacation. Meanwhile, Inez, standing at the window, saw an approaching carriage with Khaled in it. She was very glad that he arrived on time. When Khaled entered the house, he was a little surprised that only Inez was greeting him, and then he asked where Hilo was. Satisfied, Inez replied that her younger brother had gone back to the academy, so today it would be just the two of them. Walking up the stairs, Khaled asked Inez if he really should go to the banquet. After all, everyone will hate him if he appears, and Khaled also admitted that he had never been to such events. Inez stopped and looked at Khaled. She couldn't understand how such a stately man had never attended such events. Khaled explained to Inez that in crowded areas, the likelihood of emergencies occurring is much higher than on a normal day. But Inez reassured him, saying that she would be with him and he should not worry about it. When the door to the room opened, Khaled was frightened by what he saw. He did not expect this. Going inside, he saw a large number of different costumes and more. Khaled began to understand for whom it was all prepared. While Khaled looked around, Inez settled comfortably in a chair and announced that they were starting. Trying on everyone's outfits had already lasted more than 2 hours. Inez commanded the servants what clothes to serve to Khaled. Tired and exhausted, Khaled asked Inez to stop, as he could no longer stand it. Inez didn't understand why Khaled didn't like it, because if there weren't clothes here that he liked, she suggested finishing it for today and coming back to it tomorrow. After hearing this, Khaled turned silently and endured all this bullying further. As his new hairstyle was already being decided, Inez suggested leaving the length, but making the bangs shorter. The servant immediately got to work and began combing the thick jet-black hair, trying to style it as the mistress ordered. Sitting opposite Khaled, Inez watched all this and waited for the final result. When everything was ready, Inez went up to Khaled and took out a couple of strands of hair, adding that even his face had turned pink after all the changes. Having asked for a mirror, Inez thought that now with him she would not be ashamed to appear in any place. When Khaled took the mirror and began to look, his sword also decided to speak out, saying that usually the owner looks like the average resident of the country, and today he looks like a young man from a rich family. While Khaled was examining his reflection, Inez's gaze fell on his sword, and she offered not to take him to the banquet. But Khaled refused, since if the sword was not with him, he might die. Then Inez offered to decorate it too. And hearing this, the sword was glad that he was also going to the banquet. From such joy, the sword even moved a little. Inez, looking at him, noticed this and asked Khaled if this was so, and the sword added that he could still talk and nicknamed her Brulik. Inez stood a little embarrassed because she thought that she had gone crazy and was already starting to imagine things, and Khaled, looking at her, was glad that Inez did not hear the demonic sword. Then Inez ordered to decorate the sword with a ribbon and asked Khaled if it was possible to touch it. He replied that everything was fine and possible, and the sword told the owner that he would allow the Brulik to touch it. Then, making a beautiful bow out of ribbons, Inez tied it to the demonic sword. The sword asked the owner to show it in the mirror. Khaled, without hesitation, took the mirror and made the sword as he wanted. Inez watched what was happening in surprise. When everything was finished, Inez informed Khaled that he could dress like this for the banquet, but asked him to come early in the morning, since a lot of things still needed to be finalized. Inez also confronted Khaled with the fact that she would take all the clothes and accessories that he tried on today. Khaled looked at this large number of things and asked Inez why, to which she replied that it was all made according to his measurements, and these things would not suit anyone else. But Inez also added that if he didn't like this format of fittings, then next time she would simply buy a store and they would meet there. Approaching Khaled and touching his hand, Inez wanted to see what misfortune awaited him next. The butler burst into the room with the words that trouble had occurred, and said that the Marquis Herbert had arrived. Inez immediately asked him how this man got to the estate, to which the butler replied that Marquis Herbert broke in and ignored the guards. Khaled looked at Inez and did not understand what was happening, but she apologized to him and asked him to wait for her a little, since an uninvited guest had arrived. Inez headed to the first floor of the house, thinking about how good it was that Hilo returned to the academy and how the Marquise dared to show up to her. Waiting downstairs for Inez was an angry Marquis who chastised her for keeping him waiting. Then he began talking about her success in investing. Inez looked at these two and was disgusted with them. She asked the Marquis why he had come here. In a serious and forceful voice, he said to give in to the dress that Inez had ordered from Ruby Senyon. Hearing such a statement, Inez was dumbfounded, because this man, who did not come to his wife's funeral, showed up to her because of some dress. Modest Rennie stood behind Marquis and said that her sister could give her the dress, or at least leave a chance to order it. The Marquis ordered Inez to return the employees of the fashion house from vacation if she could not give up the dress, to which Inez replied that the Marquis himself could return the employees. With a smile on her face, Inez explained to him that even if she brought the employees back, they were unlikely to accept the order, and added that the Marquis was still too simple about everything. This angered the Marquis even more. He began to shout at Inez and say that she had no right to talk to her father like that. But Inez said that there is no father here. There is only a man who abandoned his children because he did not want to pay child support, and could this man afford a Ruby Senyon dress? After these words, the Marquis became furious. Raising his hand and about to hit Inez, he shouted that she was a terrible, impudent person. Suddenly, Khaled appeared behind Inez, who grabbed the hand of the Marquis Herbert and asked him what he was allowing himself. The furious Marquis asked the young man who he was to interfere in the family affairs of others. Khaled answered in a serious voice that he was Lady Eldrin's lover. Beating his chest with his hands, the Marquis shouted that he was her father and she couldn't have anyone more important. Shamer and her guards, who were ready to kill for her, hurried to the lady's aid. Inez, without the slightest doubt, ordered the guards to expel the uninvited guests from the house. When the guards began to do their job, the Marquis tried to resist, telling the guards that they had no right to do this to him. When Inez was about to leave, she said only one thing, that the Count's security was disgusting, and if this continues, then soon merchants will start visiting them. Shamour lowered her head and said that it was her fault. The Marquis shouted after him that their conversation was not over yet, and he would find a way to finish. Going out into the street, where there was complete silence and the wind was blowing through Inez's hair, she invited Khaled to take a walk in the garden. Khaled asked Inez if he did the right thing by intervening, to which she replied that he came at a very opportune time. While walking, Inez looked at Khaled because she didn't even think that he would stand up for her. Then she began to tell Khaled that this was her biological father, and the girl who was with him was her half-sister. Looking around, Inez's thoughts were about one thing: the Marquis was ready to visit the house of one daughter only because the other could not buy a dress in a famous fashion house. Inez still remembered the very day when she asked her father to help her mother, and he answered this little one that at present it was difficult to cover all the costs of treatment. He also accused her of running away from home to the Earl of Eldrin, although the Marquise tried to stop her. Then Inez, sitting in the snow, listened to the most terrible words that if she left the estate again, the Marquis would not consider her his daughter. These memories will forever remain in Inez's head, and now she asked Khaled not to worry about her personal problems and promised that this would not happen again in the future. But Khaled warned Inez that if this man appeared again, he must inform him, and then he would arrest him on the spot. And then Inez realized that no matter how Marquis Herbert kicked, he would not be able to behave as he pleased in front of the commander of the detachment of Imperial Knights, and now he would have more problems. Walking silently in such beautiful weather, Inez guessed that Khaled wanted to know a lot about her family, but was silent. But suddenly the silence was broken, and Khaled asked about the banquet and what he needed to do. After this question, Inez began to talk in detail about their actions, that when they appear at the evening, all attention will be only on them. It is not necessary to talk to everyone, and therefore she asked Khaled to just focus on her. Looking into his fiery eyes, she asked if Sir Khaled was ready to become her beloved lover. The long-awaited evening arrived. Many guests were already at the ball and discussing the sensational news about the engagement of Lady Eldrin and Khaled Asdian. Everyone was tormented by the question of why she gave preference to the owner of the demonic sword. People said all sorts of things, and it was because of this that various rumors appeared, such as that Khaled Asdian is a murderer, or that some consider him cursed. Then, noticing young Asdian, the girls decided to ask him about his older brother's engagement and whether it was true that Lady Eldrin personally visited their estate. Hearing the questions, Dihat was disgusted, because he was already upset to death by what was happening, and she kept talking about his bastard Bart. But he answered the girls that Lady Eldrin really visited their estate, and about the rest he was not sure, and he could assume that there would soon be rumors about their separation. Dihat hope for their separation, because this bastard was like a leech in their family. It is obvious that his parents were commoners, and now he is the successor of the family. But Dihat was not upset, because soon the bastard would be taken by the temple. Then he told the girl about his brother's lousy character, and that he would not be with Lady Eldrin for long. Getting excited, Dikat said that Khalid is his older brother, but sometimes Dikat does not understand him, because Khalid is always gloomy and does not know how to put himself in order. Suddenly, a beautiful couple entered the hall of the imperial palace and attracted all the guests' gazes. Dihat also turned around and could not understand which young man Lady Eldrin had come with, but he seemed very familiar to him. Walking along the path, Inez heard only compliments in her direction about her beautiful dress from Ruby Sagnon and the young man to whom she smiled so sweetly. It was a shock for the guests, because Lady Eldrin very rarely showed her smile, but here she was smiling, and even at a man. Inez began to whisper in Khalid's ear that they should stay closer to each other, and asked him to put his arm around her waist. Without the slightest doubt or unnecessary questions, and if necessary, Khalid put his arm around Inez's waist and pulled her closer to his body. Guests of the ball began to approach the beautiful couple to express their best impressions of how dazzlingly beautiful Lady Eldrin is today, and to get to know the young man better. Inez told the guests that this young man was her lover, and they tried to keep the relationship secret. But since rumors spread quickly, they decided not to hide. One of the guests was even glad that the engagement to the owner of the demonic blade was just a rumor. And then Inez decided to show all her cards, introducing her lover as Sir Khalid Azdian, adding that they were not officially engaged yet, but the rings had already been purchased. The guests could not believe their ears and eyes, because the owner of the demonic blade was really standing in front of them, and the rumors about their engagement turned out to be true. One of the guests came closer to the couple after hearing this and asked Lady Eldrin if everything was okay with her, explaining that something might happen to her because of the owner of the demonic blade. But Inez had a rather sharp tongue, and she answered the young man that none of them would expect anything to happen to her. Then Inez noticed Rani enter the hall and realized that she, as always, appeared last as the main character in order to attract as much attention as possible. Looking around, Lady Rani was a little confused, because she did not understand what kind of strange atmosphere was in the hall and whether there was really no one here who would recognize her and come up. But turning around, Lady Rani noticed her half-sister with a young man whom she had seen at her home, and when they met their eyes, Inez realized that today's banquet would be very entertaining. Music sounded, and it was announced that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived, and as he walked along the hall to the throne, all the guests bowed low to greet him. Khalid, with a serious face, like all the other guests, bowed to His Majesty, but in his heart he felt very awkward and uncomfortable. Walking along the carpet and noticing Khalid Azdian, His Majesty the Emperor even paused and looked him up and down and continued walking. Inez thought that despite His Majesty's blonde hair and blue eyes, she saw Khalid in him, and she also wondered why the Emperor was so surprised to see Khalid at the banquet, since he had also received an invitation. Sitting on the throne, His Majesty the Emperor said glory to the Venetian Empire and thanked everyone for being able to find time, despite their busy schedules. The butler told the guests that today their duchy had specially selected 100-year-old pearls for the birthday of His Majesty the Emperor, and they also delivered wine from the best grape varieties of their empire. Holiness's representative also presented a gift for His Majesty the Emperor. I will extend to His Majesty a branch of the sacred Igfrid tree to bless and protect Venetian. His Majesty the Emperor was pleasantly surprised by such a gift. He asked to convey words of gratitude to His Holiness. Seeing the branch of the sacred tree for the first time, something began to clench in Inez's chest, and she had the feeling that it was calling her. Looking around, Inez thought about whether everyone had this feeling, or maybe because of this feeling the tree is called sacred. The representative of Holiness turned around and began to pierce Khalid with his gaze. Inez noticed this look and appreciated it, as if it measured how long Khalid had left to live. But then Inez noticed the heir to the throne and looked into his eyes, thinking that it would be nice to establish a connection with the ruling family as a businessman. Although Inez understood that most of the ruling family were rude and decided that it was better to avoid the prince as much as possible. Returning to Kayod, Ines decided that now that everyone remembered her, she could leave, because they came here to show off with their lover, and not to get closer to other people. Inez asked Khaled if he wanted to drink something, but he refused such an offer. Then Inez imperceptibly pressed her finger into Khaled's chest, hinting that his answer was wrong. Realizing this, Khaled immediately agreed with Inez's proposal. When the guests approached Lady Eldrin to discuss some business matters, she replied that her dear lover was thirsty and therefore they were leaving. While only the two of them were in the hall, Inez offered Khaled apple juice because he liked it. But Khaled replied that he didn't seem to like it very much. And when Inez suggested replacing apple juice with wine, Khaled said that it was not necessary and took the glass from Inez's hand. Then Inez was convinced once again that Khaled liked apples and simply did not want to show his weakness. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by Duchess Helios, asking Lady Eldrin how she was doing and whether she liked this evening. Inez was a little surprised by surprise and replied that everything was fine with her, asking the Duchess a counter question whether she was having fun at the ball. Suddenly, the Duchess's face changed at the sight of the owner of the demonic blade and asked Lady Eldrin to give her a moment of time. Kissing Khaled on the cheek, Inez told him that she would be back soon and asked him to wait a little. When Inez left, Khaled put his hand to the cheek where Inez kissed him, remembering one day from her little happy childhood. That day, while sitting at the dining table, Khaled accidentally touched Dihat. He didn't like it, and Dihat asked his mother to put him in another place. But his mother made a different decision, telling Khaled that now he would eat in his room. Continuing to keep his hand on his cheek, Khaled wondered if he was not disgusting to Inez. Standing to the side, Khaled continued to wait for Inez, but suddenly the sword informed him that Dihat's henchmen were heading towards him. And the sword was not mistaken. 3 young people came up with the words that they were excited when they heard about the owner of the demonic blade. But they found out that Khaled was nothing of himself, and who was he anyway to be with Lady Eldrin? Khaled looked at them with an imperturbable gaze, and the sword told the owner that these guys were simply jealous of him because their brulik was very popular. They continued to say that Khaled simply bribed Lady Eldrin to please her, assuring him that this would not last long due to the fact that he brings misfortune. But suddenly the sword felt that Dihat was also heading towards them and suggested that they hit him in the face once and then go on the run. Dihat stood in front of Khaled and told him that it doesn't matter whether he is the commander of the knights or anyone else. Dihat will surpass him and crush his calm here and now. Then Dihat began to talk about what his family had lost because of such a bastard as Khaled, but their problems would be solved when he was taken to the temple, and he should leave Lady Eldrin alone so as not to bring trouble. Khaled came even closer to Dihat and proposed an experiment to see if his misfortune could be passed on to another. Taking the demonic blade in his hands and handing it to Dihat, Khaled said how funny it would be if they were unhappy together, and Dihat became the next owner of the demonic blade. Dihat's people ran away in fear after such a proposal, and Dihat himself, being in a panic, promised Khaled that they would talk about this situation at home. The sword was outraged by this owner's proposal, but Khaled explained to him that if they started a fight, then he was obliged to do something similar. Duchess Helios asked Lady Eldrin about the man with whom she came, whether it was true that he was the owner of the demonic sword. Inez silently nodded her head. Then Duchess Helios told the reason why she called Inez. She wanted to discuss some deal, but suddenly they heard some kind of showdown, and the Duchess assumed that someone didn't get along. Inez also looked around and wondered who had such impudence to come to such a place and start fights, who has no manners. But noticing Khaled and the crowd of guys, Inez could not believe that they were talking about her goose. Inez's eyes lit up because if something bad happens, they will really be discussed for a very long time. Then Inez suggested that the Duchess postpone this conversation until next time, unless of course there was any urgency in it. The Duchess felt uneasy, realizing that she was greatly delaying Lady Eldrin, but Inez reassured the Duchess, saying that she was simply worried about Khaled. These words surprised the Duchess very much, because she guessed that Inez entered into a relationship for some reason, but it turned out that Khaled Asdian was really not indifferent to her. After such words, Inez realized that the Duchess was very smart, but admitted to her that she herself did not think that she could fall in love with someone so much that she would go head over heels. Then Duchess Helios did not dare to detain Lady Eldrin and released her rather to her lover. Returning to Khalad excitedly, Ines immediately asked what happened, but Khalad replied that everything was fine, and then Ines suggested going out onto the terrace to get some fresh air. Going out onto the terrace and looking into emptiness, Khalad asked Ines if she had any regrets, since she herself saw very well what people thought about him. But for Ines, such a reaction was expected. She was more worried about why Khalad was so unsure of himself, or whether he wanted Ines to abandon him. But this was impossible. Ines encouraged Khalad, telling him that he did a great job and it was better to seem crazy than good-natured, and she doesn't regret it at all. But on the contrary, she's glad that Khalad accompanied her to the banquet. Throughout the evening, Ines realized that people are afraid of Khalad, so the number of those spreading rumors will decrease after today's banquet. Looking at Khalad, Ines admitted that she had no reason to be the first to break the contract, although she still did not understand what was bothering him so much. Clenching his hand into a fist, he asked Ines the only question, why she was doing this to him, since he understood that it was all a game. Ines had a lot of thoughts in her head. She didn't understand why Khalad thought that she couldn't be kind without a reason, and no matter how much Ines supported him, it wasn't enough for him. Then Ines decided to confess and told Khalad that he was her type. Running her hand through his hair, she explained that she had a crush on handsome men, and today he looked especially beautiful. And abruptly changing the topic, Ines said that she had seen Dihat Azdeyan and asked him to tell him what happened between them. Reluctantly, Khalad had to admit to Ines that when an argument arose, he had to say a few kind words to Dihat. After this, Ines asked Khalad if he wanted to move out of the Azdeyan's house, because she could help in this matter. Khalad, with a sad look, explained to Ines that if he left the mansion, he would have to renounce the Azdeyan family, and he would then become a commoner and could not be a member of the Order of the Imperial Knights. After hearing what she heard, Ines remembered her only trip to the Azdeyan's house, and even then she noticed that they treated Khalad as if he did not exist at all. The whole evening flashed before Ines's eyes, and she realized that everything had gone quite quietly, and even after their arrival at the banquet, a series of accidents had not occurred. Even after Ines kissed Khalad on the cheek, nothing unusual happened. Walking closer to Khalad, hugging him and pressing closer and closer, Ines said that she needed to make sure of something. Khalad did not expect such an action and stood rooted to the spot, and Ines understood that the scale of the misfortune varies depending on the level of contact, but as she expected, it would not happen without incident. Suddenly, Khalad sharply pushes Ines away from him and asks her what she is doing, hearing in response that she is just trying to see misfortune. Confused, Khalad suggested doing this as before, just touching the hand without any hugs. But Ines didn't seem to hear him and hugged him again, saying that depending on the level of contact, she could see different misfortunes, giving an example that she can see much wider and deeper if she holds his hand, and not just by hugging him or if she hugs him like now. Then Ines decided to invite Khalad to try touching their lips for better vision. Khalad pushed Ines away with a frightened look, saying that she had definitely gone crazy. He turned around and headed towards the entrance to the hall, telling Ines that he would bring them something to drink. Turning around and looking into the distance, Ines realized what a cutie Khalad was. She got scared and simply ran away. Hearing footsteps and turning around sharply, Ines expected to see Khalad returning, but an uninvited guest came to her. It was the prince who asked Lady Eldrin to give him a moment of her time. Making a bow, Ines greeted His Majesty the Crown Prince. The prince admitted that he had heard a lot about Lady Eldrin, but saw her for the first time. He also asked if it was true that she was dating the owner of the demonic blade. Ines nodded her head. With a malicious smile on his face, the prince complimented Ines, saying that she was beautiful, but he felt sorry for her. Ines did not remain silent, and answered the prince that her lover was not the person who would calmly listen to such things. Although even for her, it was too much. After asking for forgiveness and saying that he did not mean to offend her, the prince boasted that Sir Khalad Azdeyan was his pride. Ines looked at the prince and noticed that he spoke as if he had looked into the terrace by mistake, although the curtains were drawn, and this already made it clear that there was someone there. Leaning on the parapet, the prince began to talk about Count Eldrin, who had long retired from family affairs, and now everyone believed that Lady Eldrin had taken the place of the real head of the family. The prince said that he was looking for young and talented people to help him, and therefore invited Lady Eldrin to enter politics. He wanted Ines to become his political partner, But looking at the young prince, Inez expected to hear something completely different, but as it turned out, he was already trying to strengthen his power. The crown prince was the only son of the emperor, and at present the authority of the emperor is unshakable. No one seeks to fight with him for power, so when the time comes, the throne will pass to the prince. But the prince decided not to stop only at political relations. He also invited Lady Eldrin to enter into a relationship with him. Inez was shocked by what she heard, because by relationship he means the position of the crown princess. But no matter how attractive the offer was, Inez did not know what he was planning. The prince could use her and throw her out. Then Inez thanked her for such an unexpected offer and asked for time to think. The prince understood that for Lady Eldrin the proposal sounded very unexpected, and in this case he gave her time to think. But he also added that if she refuses him this offer, it will definitely not be in her favor. Leaving the terrace, the prince looked back and said that he hoped for a positive response and wished Lady Eldrin a good time. Looking after him, Inez could not even imagine that his methods for attracting forces would be so radical that they would even use threats. Now she understood why she felt so unpleasant when their eyes crossed. Clenching her hand into a fist, Inez realized that she would have problems if the next emperor became an enemy, but she could not allow herself to be used, so she decided to touch him next time and find out his weaknesses. Meanwhile, Rennie, while in the hall, realized that the banquet in the imperial palace she was attending for the first time in her life was different from her expectations. After all, she so wanted to attract the attention of as many people as possible that she even appeared at the last moment, but everyone was busy with something else. Remembering how Inez left the hall, Rennie looked at her dress that was supposed to go to her. And also the man who next to her is the owner of a demonic blade. Suddenly, Miss Bridget came up to Ronnie and whispered in her ear that she was afraid if the owner of the demonic blade suddenly went crazy. Also, Miss Bridget heard that she was ugly, but she never would have thought that in reality he would be handsome. Ronnie, biting her lips, understood that the rumors about Inez's relationship with the owner of the demonic blade were true. But Miss Bridget was very worried about the question about Lady Herbert's dress, whether it was true that it was from the Ruby Sanon salon, because it was so different from what was sewn in the salon before. Then Rennie explained to the girls that this dress was from another salon, since at the Ruby Sanon salon, the employees accidentally ruined her dress, and she could not wear it. The girls were shocked by what they heard, but Rennie's plans did not include conversations with these ladies. She wanted to make a grand debut and surround herself with the people she deserves. Noticing Khaled Asdian, Ronnie went straight to him, without even apologizing to the girls that she needed to go away. Having caught up with Khaled Asdian, Ronnie greeted with a sweet smile, and looking at him, she realized that she could not control her emotions since she first saw this man, and now she wanted to get him. Khaled looked at Lady Ronnie with a blank stare and simply remained silent in response. Lady Ronnie assumed that Sir Khaled Asdian did not remember her and began to talk about what a mistake had been made and that her sister Inez had misunderstood everything, so Ronnie wanted to apologize. Khaled asked what Lady Ronnie would like to apologize for, and embarrassedly she replied that she did not want to involve the young master in family squabbles. In this case, Khaled Asdian suggested that the young lady apologize to Lady Eldrin and not to him. Lowering her eyes to the floor, Rennie began to explain that Inez was to blame for everything that day, since she did not listen to her father's words, and the problem could be solved calmly, also telling Khaled that Inez always caused nothing but trouble for the family. After hearing this whole interesting story and without giving any answer, Khaled said that in that case he would go about his business. But suddenly, Lady Ronnie grabs Khaled by the hand and begins to say that she doesn't care who they think he is, even if he is the owner of a demonic blade. She thinks that Khaled Asdian is a very good person. Having heard all this, Khaled looked at Lady Ronnie with a piercing gaze and asked her a question about why she decided that he was a good person, and, in general, what she could know about him. Listening to all these questions, the surprised Lady Ronnie did not understand why he was reacting this way, since she thought that she would touch him with her words. At that time, Inez was still on the terrace and was already beginning to worry about Khaled, because he said that he would bring something to drink and come back. Inez began to think that something could happen to him and looked out into the hall. When Inez saw that Ronnie was standing next to Khaled, she immediately approached them and asked what the two of them were doing here. Looking back and noticing Inez standing next to her, Ronnie hoped that she would not get into trouble for simply chatting with Sir Asdean. Happy Ronnie greeted her sister so joyfully, reminding her that they had not seen each other for so long. Inez was surprised to hear this, and thought that Ronnie had something with her memory, and reminded her that they had seen each other a couple of days ago. When she and the Marquis showed up at her house and demanded a dress, Inez assumed that Ruby Sagnon did not accept Ronnie's order. This statement was heard by the girls standing behind them, and they did not understand what it meant, because Lady Ronnie told them that she could not wear the sewn dress due to an error on the part of the staff. These words hurt Ronnie very much, and she told Inez that she'd placed the order, but there was a problem, and that's why she couldn't wear it. Inez understood that these were pathetic excuses and decided to ask what Rennie wanted from her lover, to which Inez heard that Rennie simply decided to say hello, since last time she had not been able to introduce herself properly. Inez took it all in stride, and just saying hello was not about Rennie. Then Inez said that everything was expected, because blood is not water. Hearing this phrase, Rennie was very surprised and hoped that she heard it true. But Inez insisted on her own and said that Rennie reminded her of an unscrupulous woman who longs to get someone else's man and will not forgive destroying someone else's family. Because of such insults, Ronnie asked Inez to be careful with her expressions, and Ronnie added that her status was much higher. But Inez decided to simply fool Rennie, because she didn't even say who exactly she was talking about, and Rennie was already on edge. And about Inez's status, she said that now she can flaunt it to her heart's content. Clutching a fan in her hands, Ronnie was angry and urgently asked Inez not to insult her. Otherwise, it might end badly. Laughing, Inez suggested that Ronnie would again go to complain to the Marquis Herbert. This was the last straw of Lady Ronnie, and she threw the fan at Inez's feet with the words that she was challenging her to a duel. A duel with a lady involves a sword contest between their representatives, and the loser must publicly apologize to the winner, many spending large sums to hire a representative. Inez, without a moment's hesitation, accepted Lady Rainey's challenge, warning that she would choose a place for the duel. Of course, Inez chose Khaled as her representative, and Ronnie had to inform about her representative 3 days before the duel. A couple of hours ago, when Inez hugged Khaled on the balcony, she had already seen the whole situation, and this was to be expected, because it would not have happened without incidents. Sitting already in the carriage and heading home, Inez offered Khaled to give half of the profits if he became her representative. But as a true gentleman and lover of Lady Eldrin, Khaled advised that this was not necessary. But Inez asked Khaled not to refuse the offer so easily, because she already felt that they were the ones who would hit the jackpot. Inez turned to Khaled and suggested that imperial support alone was not enough to lead the knightly order, and she would like to help with this. And Inez also warned Khaled that Lady Ronnie would have a person no less talented than him. The next day, sitting in her office, Inez thought that the duel was a very good idea for Rennie, and it would be nice to break her and win, because this would attract a lot of people's attention. Suddenly, Inez came up with the idea of opening her own business, which would attract a large number of people from society. And then she decided to put up stands for spectators, charge money for admission, and then promote the new business and product. When Inez received approval from Khaled, she immediately got down to business, because she needed to develop a product to advertise the duel. Arriving at a store where a huge amount of cosmetics was sold, Inez wanted to give preference to it the last time. But after examining all the shelves, she realized that nothing had changed since her last visit here, and the quality of the goods was mediocre for such a price, and there were not as many positions as we would like. Inez understood that the market was monopolized by several companies. It was not that big, and therefore the cosmetics market was not attractive to businessmen. Although Inez remembered one of the misfortunes that she had seen, namely that the cosmetics business would grow so much. Continuing to look at different bottles, Inez knew that the cosmetics market would be a success, but she did not understand what was the impetus for it. For Inez, the most important thing was to differentiate from existing products and create that very new product that would revolutionize the entire market. Suddenly, Inez heard a young girl asking to tell a consultant about her new product, or asking her to leave the store. But the girl insists on her promise not to take much time, holding out her product so that she can at least just take a look. But the consultant pushes the girl's hand away and asks her not to interfere. how at this time the girl's new product slips out of her hands and falls right in front of Lady Eldrin's feet. Shamer, without delay, picks up this product from the floor and gives it to the mistress. Having examined it, Inez could not understand what it was. Then Inez told the girl that her product was in her hands. The girl came closer, thanked the lady, and while taking her thing, accidentally touched Inez's hands. And then Inez saw that the cosmetics market had grown significantly after the launch of the girl's products. But if she had received more investment, she would have been more successful. Inez asked the girl for forgiveness for accidentally touching her, but there was only one thing in her thoughts: the person because of whom the market would start moving came to her himself. Inez immediately decided to ask what the sweet girl had dropped, but before she could answer anything, the consultant immediately warned that if they were not going to buy anything, they could leave the premises right now. Looking at this poor consultant, Inez told her that lately, in department stores, you have to pay even just to be in them, and ordered Shamer to buy something. Shamer addressed the lady by her first and last name and immediately went to make a purchase, when suddenly the consultant's face changed because she had contradicted Lady Eldrin herself. Now Inez offered to talk to the girl in private, but she could not believe her ears that Mistress Inez Eldrin was standing in front of her. The girl handed her business card to Lady Eldrin and introduced herself as Lachey Solea, adding that she had her own small business. And then Lachey began to talk about her product, that when developing them, the most important priority was convenience, so that the product could be easily taken with you anywhere. Inez knew that this was an amazing product, a lip product that she could easily carry with her. It was exactly what she was looking for. Lachey also explained to Lady Eldrin that they had not yet found a distribution route and had not established large-scale production, since there was no normal investment. To be completely sure, Inez decided to check the girl again, asking Lachey if there was a need to engage in mass production, since it is currently difficult to distribute their product. In a confident voice, without the slightest doubt, Lachey laid everything out, explaining that they have been studying market trends and producing cosmetics for more than 5 years, and this product will revolutionize the market. And she also wants to lay a solid foundation so that there are no drawdowns in the future. Meanwhile, while trying the Lachey product, Inez admitted that she likes people with ambitions because to achieve success, you need to want it. Having tried the lipstick, Inez approved the product. Then Lachey started talking about investing, but Inez immediately interrupted her. Having said that she will not invest, she will simply buy them, because if Lachey gets to the top, Lady Eldrin will give her full support, and next time the consultant will be begging her to enter the store. Lachey thanked Lady Eldrin for her kind words, but to her shame, she admitted that during the development of the product, she had incurred large debts. Inez laughed and revealed Lachey's terrible secret that when you start your own business, debts are inevitable, so she was ready to pay all her debts. Inez asked Lachey where she took the money, in a bank or somewhere else. Waving her hands, Lachey said that she did not take anything from the bank, but took it from the financial company Amon. Amon is a moneylender company that was very well known to Inez because it manages a gambling house, the worst of all evils. Lachey admitted that she took $300,000 from them, but then she was informed that, taking into account interest, her debt increased to $500,000, and at the moment the interest has increased even more. Inez understood that going to Amon was not the best decision, but once she herself had no choice but to go there, so now she was ready to repay Lachey's entire loan, but with one condition, that it would lead her to the top. Surprised, Lachey asked why Lady Eldrin agreed to this step. Looking at Lachey, Inez replied that she believed in her profitability, but in her thoughts, Inez had no idea why she was so honest with people whom she saw for the first time in her life. With her hands folded on her chest and in a serious voice, Inez asked Lachey if she was sure that she could lead the business to success, because Inez was confident in her proposal, and if she agreed to sign the contract, she would live her life without needing anything. After this, Lachey's eyes lit up and she promised Lady Eldrin that she would lead her to the top. Going out into the street, Inez invited Lachey to make herself comfortable in the carriage. Shamour asked the lady where to take them. Inez asked to take them to the financial company Amon. Rumors have already begun to circulate in the Asdian house that Lady Herbert challenged Lady Eldrin to a duel, even saying that this duel is for a man, and the one who will win and get him. Listening to all this gossip, Khaled dreamed only of a quiet life, and now he himself has become a representative in the duel. Khaled recalled Inez's words that this was a very profitable offer, and half of the profit she mentioned would be a good help for the third detachment of knights, which lacks finances. In addition, Khaled was ready to fight with any opponent, because before he picked up the demonic Che, he often participated in sparring in the first squad. But that was before, and now that he was the commander of the third detachment of knights, Khaled did not have time for fencing because of business, because the third detachment occupies the lowest position among the knights. Thinking about work, Khaled's mind still couldn't leave thoughts about Inez, saying that she was greedy for handsome men and that Khaled looked especially beautiful today. Arriving at the appointed place, Khaled told his knights about his plans, that today their main goal was the gambling house of Aemon. As Khaled was told, illegal drug transactions are taking place there, and their goal is to catch the moment of the transaction and detain those involved, so they must be focused. Before they had time to go inside, his knights noticed that the first bet was already beginning, where the bet was 18 million prowls. The knights were shocked by the amount they heard and began to calculate how many years they could earn this pile of money. There were only two assumptions in Khaled's head: that it was an avid gambler, or that there was another person like Inez who was ready to bet that amount, when suddenly a lady with the same ash-blonde hair walked in front of him. Having sat down at the gaming table, Hamad asked Inez if she would regret it later. But Inez was confident in herself, and replied that she needed to wait until the end of the game to find out. But half an hour before the game, a lot of interesting things happened. For example, Hamad, the head of Aemon, did not expect to meet Mrs. Inez Eldrin as a guest. After greeting each other, Hamad reminded Inez that many years had passed since their last meeting. But Inez did not stand on ceremony for a long time and explained to Hamad that she had come to him on Lachey's business and intended to pay off her debt in the amount of 300,000 prul. Hamad laughed, because if the principal amount of the debt is 300,000, taking into account interest, this amount has increased to somewhere around 900,000. Inez asked Hamad if this was written down somewhere, to which he replied that everything was described in the document. If a person did not repay the debt, then the interest doubled. But for Inez, this was all familiar. And as it turned out, no matter how many years passed, nothing changes in the past. Hamad was very tired of Inez, and so she gave everything he asked. And this nasty look that is desperate to get a higher interest rate continues to deceive naive people. Inez told Hamad that 900,000 is not such a big amount, but in Inez's subconscious, she is not ready to give even one prul to such a scumbag like him. Taking out the check and starting to write it out, Inez said that according to rumors, Hamad had recently lost a lot of money. She hoped that the gambling house and gambling had nothing to do with it. Grinning, Hamad reminded Inez that he was once a very famous person. Having written a check for 900,000, Inez invited Hamad to argue with her. Having told him the rules that the base bet will be 900,000, in addition, the loser will be charged a fine of another 900,000 and a total amount of 18 million. Hamad's eyes lit up at this proposal and he agreed. Inez offered to shake hands so that everything would go fairly and without deception. When the table was prepared and the players took their places, Hamad let Lady Eldrin be the first to start the game. Having thrown the dice and taken her first card in her hands, Inez could not believe that she was already seeing misfortune. The range of her abilities was truly expanding. As it turned out, Hamad was rigging the dice, but Inez did not expect a fair match with him and came up with a way to solve this problem. It was Hamad's turn to roll the dice. He was clearly determined to win. After throwing the dice, it turned out that Hamad actually won the first round. He was very happy about this because he was closer to 18 million. When it was Inez's turn, she picked up the dice and accidentally jerked her hand, and the dice fell to the floor and shattered into many pieces. Having asked for forgiveness, Inez said that now they needed new dice. Hamad reassured Lady and said that he would prepare everything now, but Inez stopped Hamad and said that the dice were the same everywhere and could be borrowed from the next table. Before throwing the dice, Inez remembered a moment from her childhood about the same gambling house Aemon before the death of her mother. Inez told her that she would not tell anyone about her ability. But after some time, Ines broke her promise. Her mother was in such serious condition that she could not get out of bed, and the costs of treatment only grew. The Earl of Eldrin was on the verge of bankruptcy due to the support of the Marquis Herbert. Everyone refused to lend a helping hand, and Ines had no choice but to take out a loan. In those difficult times, Hilo was very scared, because different people very often came to their house and demanded to pay for the debt. And after each such visit, Hilo shouted to Ines to sell the mansion for the debts. But Ines reassured her brother every time, telling him that she would soon sort everything out. And when Ines was left with a huge debt that she could not pay, she decided to use her abilities and protect her family. Instead of going to the Amon moneylenders, Ines went to the Amon gambling house, and from then on she began to actively use her ability. It happened this time too, a couple of light hand movements, and Ines already had wonderful winning cards. Hamad was not prepared for defeat and began to accuse Lady Eldrin of cheating, since she could not have such good cards. Ines was slightly shocked by the accusations she heard, asking Hamad if he had any evidence in this regard. But Hamad insisted, hitting the table with his fist and saying that this couldn't happen. Ines began to explain to him that if she had cheated, Hamad would have lost his credibility, because he was the owner of a gambling house, which means people are being deceived here. These words made Hamad very angry, but leaving the table, Ines asked him not to be such a gentleman in the future. Moving further and further from the table, Ines also reminded about the bet of 900,000 and the fine of 900,000, which Hamad had to cover by the end of the evening. Approaching Shamer and Lachey, they admired Mistress Ines, telling her that they supported and believed in her victory. Then Ines suggested returning to her business, since one problem had already been solved, but suddenly, on the second floor, Ines noticed a man who looked painfully like Kalod. Ines warned Shamor that she would go up to the second floor to meet her goose and asked the girls to wait a little. Having gone up to the second floor, Ines found no one. She could not understand how Kalod could disappear so quickly. Having walked a little further, Ines's ability worked, and she saw another of Kalod's misfortunes, for which he blames himself, since Ines herself will suffer because of him. Ines, continuing to stand on the second floor, did not understand why she should suffer, when suddenly Kalod appears behind her and asks her the question of what she is doing here. Turning to face Kalod, Ines began to explain to him that she had come to pay off the debt of her business partner. Satisfied, Ines, with a smile on her face, asked Sir Kalod what he was doing in the Amon gambling house. Kalod only had time to say that he was on a mission when Ines had already begun to offer her help and say that he had just missed the criminal after contacting him. Closing her eyes and waiting, Ines only thought that Kalod just needed to ask for help. But unfortunately this did not happen. So Ines took matters into her own hands and pointed to the man in red who was on the ground floor. At that moment, the Knights of Kalod came up to them on the second floor, who were a little shocked to see the commander alone. Kalod immediately ordered to catch the man in red standing on the first floor. A couple of seconds later, that man was already lying on the floor and screaming for these strange people to let him go. Kalod also came down to them, showing his badge. He explained to the man in red that he was arrested for drug trafficking. And at that moment, Ines noticed a new victim, and turning to Kalod, suggested that he eliminate the problem at the root. Going up to the second floor, Ines understood that Hamad had a disgusting side, and when she approached his office, she pulled the door handle. It turned out to be closed. Then Kalod asked Ines to move a little to the side, and with one blow knocked out the door to Hamad's office. When Ines and Kalod went inside, they noticed Hamad hastily collecting all his jewelry and money. Everything was as Ines expected. As soon as the knights appeared, this cowardly dog immediately rushed to get his goods and run. An enraged Hamad began yelling at Ines that this was all her doing, and she had deliberately set him up in front of the knights. But the unperturbed Ines reminded Hamad that one cannot be such a greedy person, because sooner or later everything will end in tears. Hamad was in no hurry to give up his money, proving to Kalod that he had worked hard to earn it all. Kalod was tired of listening to all this nonsense, and he preferred to resolve the issue differently, hitting Hamad so that he would come to his senses. But at that moment, a huge wrought iron chandelier on the ceiling began to sway right above Kalod, and Ines had no choice but to save him. By jumping on Kalod and knocking him down, Ines saved him, without even thinking about her health for a minute. Having come to her senses, Ines began to examine Kalod and ask him if he was injured since the misfortune was avoided. Having risen, the sword informed the owner that the Brulik was wounded, and Khaled immediately began to ask Inez what and where was bothering her. But Inez modestly replied that there was a slight pain in her ankle. Grabbing Inez in his arms, Khaled asked her forgiveness for such an uncomfortable situation and said that they would now move to a quieter place and he would examine her ankle himself. But Inez reminded Khaled that Hamad was lying in the middle of the room, but for this Khaled asked her not to worry, since his knights would take care of him. Having found a secluded place and seated Inez on the sofa, Khaled asked permission to examine her ankle. Upon examination, Khaled saw small abrasions and a bruise. He immediately provided first aid and recommended that Inez see a doctor upon arrival home. Inez tried to reassure Khaled that in a few days everything would be fine and the bruises would go away along with the pain. But Khaled didn't seem to hear Inez, thinking that he was just lucky, because if someone else had been in Inez's place, he would have received more serious injuries. Khaled didn't want anyone to get hurt because of him. With glassy eyes, Khaled decided that it was stupid to prevent misfortunes, and next time everything might end differently. He warned Inez for the last time that if she wants to live a normal life, then it is better for them not to be together. Since his misfortune is like a virus, Khaled always caused pain to those around him, and in the end he was left alone with the insult, because such pain can only be endured alone. So Khaled asked Inez not to approach him anymore. Inez was taken aback by what she heard, answering Khaled that if she was going to give up, she would not have started all this. Inez began to tell Khaled that it can take a very long time to look for the root cause of misfortune, and that is why people blame either themselves or others. Raising Khaled's head a little and looking into his eyes, Inez finished with a very important fact that she would survive even if the whole world came to an end. After these words, Khaled no longer wanted to hope for anything. He abandoned everything and fenced himself off with a wall in order to take it for granted. But today he had the feeling that for the first time he saw someone behind this solid wall. Khaled wanted to believe for once that he would live and smile despite the misfortunes. A few days later, while going on business, Seymour handed over a letter from Lachey to Mrs. Inez, in which Lachey wrote that the production capacity was 100 pieces per day, and in a week they would be able to start production. Inez asked Shamora how the renovations were going on regarding the interior of the store, to which Shamora replied that everything was almost ready, oddly enough for Inez, but everything was going very well. Seymour also informed the lady that Hamad had been thrown behind bars and his property had been seized, and therefore he would not be able to get bail. Such news pleased Inez. She told Shamor about the location of the cash which she saw when she came into contact with Hamad, and ordered to donate all that money to the orphanage anonymously. Moving her leg more comfortably, Inez remembered about her ankle. Everything happened as she said. After a few days of rest, the swelling and bruises became less, and now she could walk normally. Seymour spoke out about what happened, telling the mistress that this was not at all like her, but usually the mistress solved problems without personal involvement. Inez explained that she knew from Khaled's misfortune that she herself would suffer, but she did not have time to think it over, and the body moved on its own. After such a question, Inez still thought about the fact that no matter how important Khaled is, he is not more important than herself. But why exactly at that moment? Her heart began to beat much stronger, and she rushed to protect him. But all Inez's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden braking of the carriage. Frightened, Seymour asked the mistress how she was. And from the street came the voice of the coachman, who was also interested in the condition of the mistress, explaining all this by the fact that someone had suddenly jumped out in front of the carriage. At the same time, in the imperial palace, His Majesty was informed that Duke Helios had arrived. Having given the go-ahead to enter, Duke Helios greeted His Majesty, who is the son of the Empire, at the threshold, but Carais asked to discard all these formalities, since they had known the Duke for a very long time. Duke Helios was the father-in-law of the Emperor and the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights. He asked His Majesty on what business he had summoned him. His Majesty asked Helios what he knew about Khaled Azdian, but he replied that Khaled was a member of the Imperial Knights. Then His Majesty decided to assume that Khaled Azdian could be a relative of Duke Helios, and upon hearing such a suggestion, the Duke bowed down. And His Majesty continued to say that he was very surprised when he saw Khaled at the knighting ceremony, a man who looked very much like his late daughter. Duke Helios confirmed the identity of Khaled Azdian with Her Majesty the Empress, as Chaereas expected, which even the Duke confirmed. But Khaled Azdian was not his son. Helios clarified that the duchy carefully monitors collateral relatives, so it would be impossible to hide the child. His Majesty recalled the day when the Empress was pregnant, because she then imagined that the child would have her face, but it turns out that Khaled Azdian is the same age as the Crown Prince. Duke Helios was indignant. He did not understand what His Majesty wanted to say, because despite how bad his relationship was with His Highness the Crown Prince, how could he think of such a thing? And His Majesty recalled the day when the Empress gave birth. On that day he left the palace for a while, and upon hearing the news of the birth of the child, he immediately hurried to the Empress. But she died during childbirth, and Chaereas saw his son a month later, as he was busy with the funeral of his wife. That day, the midwives and maids reported that the Empress had given birth to a baby, but they also mentioned the mark of belonging to the ruling family. But Chaereas could not understand why he could not get rid of the trembling that ran through him, why he suspected his own son and not the Empress. The day of the duel arrived. A crowd of people gathered in the knight's arena, since no one had staged such grandiose duels for a long time, and the atmosphere was some kind of festival. At the arena, people asked each other who was betting on whom, and those who didn't understand what they were talking about were immediately explained to him that tickets for betting were being sold in front of the arena. Standing in the crowd of people placing bets or rushing to place money, Inez knew that today she would make a lot of money, and the one who had already made his bid and took his place of honor was discussing the latest gossip about the owner of the demonic blade, saying that although he is a representative of the Imperial Knights, he cannot defeat the mercenary who lives on the battlefield. Walking to her place of honor, Inez heard talk that Lady Herbert had made a lot of efforts to get the Black Wolf. But Inez was only amused. Taking a seat in her loggia, Inez asked Shamer how things were going with the ratio. Shamer, having studied the entire table, reported that the ratio was 7-2 in their favor. Inez ordered Shamer to bet more on them, because the greater the difference, the higher the profit. The main thing is that the odds do not fall. A mercenary from Lady Herbert's side, nicknamed the Black Wolf, had already tried to provoke Khaled, inviting him to refuse the fight, since he promised Lady Rainey not to spoil the pretty face of his opponent. But in the end, he added that he would not be able to control the situation if he lost his temper, and before the situation got out of control, he suggested that everything should be resolved amicably. Khaled looked at his opponent as if he were a small child, reminding him that they were having a duel, not a debate. When the duelists heard that the duel had begun, their swords locked in a fierce battle. Only sparks flew from the swords, just like from their masters, who were determined to win. While fighting, Khaled's head heard the words of Inez, which she told him before the duel. She asked him not to let everything end too quickly. Inez asked Khaled to keep his opponent on his feet longer. Khaled tried to explain to Inez that he couldn't do that because when it came to fencing, he wanted to fight with his full strength. Inez understood Khaled's feelings, but asked people to understand as well when they were expecting a battle, and it was over in a minute, especially since they paid for admission. So Khaled must provide the people with a spectacle. Khaled knew that he would have to keep his end of the deal, since he agreed to half the profits that Inez offered. During the entire duel, Khaled heard from the stands only that he was weak, that without a demonic blade he was worth nothing, and if he was a member of the Imperial Knights, he should at least be able to use a sword. His opponent also added fuel to the fire, telling the owner of the demonic blade that he was nothing. But Khaled could not even imagine that his opponent's skills would be so poor, since he hoped that he would fight against a worthy and stronger fighter. This whole show began to bore Khaled, and he began to act, showing everyone what he was really capable of, stopping fighting at half strength. The spectators in the stands were horrified when they saw Khaled Azdian corner the mercenary. The Black Wolf was hurt by this because he did not want to give up and disgrace himself in front of so many people, so he warned Khaled that his end would come very soon. But after these words, Khaled realized that it was time to end all this acting, and having gained strength, he hit his opponent's sword, so that it scattered into small pieces throughout the arena. Everyone began to applaud, and throughout the arena words were heard about the victory of the owner of the demonic blade, Khaled Azdian. In other words, Lady Inez Eldrin becomes the winner of the duel. Khalad stood without the slightest emotion on his face. His only thoughts were about what a boring duel it was, and whether Inez would be happy about this victory. Going down to Khalad, Inez wiped the sweat from his face and told him what a great guy he was, and that he had gotten the better of his opponent in the end very coolly. But now was the perfect time for Inez to advertise her new product, although Khalad was surprised by it. The girls were surprised and rose from their seats to better see what Lady Inez was applying to her lips. Returning again to Khalad and holding him to her, Inez thanked him for the victory that he achieved for her sake and tenderly kissed him on the cheek as a sign of gratitude. Meanwhile, Rennie was on edge and had already gone down to the joyful Inez, who not only was advertising her product, but also kissed her lover in front of everyone. Inez asked Rennie if she wanted to tell her something, but Rennie, as always, taking everything with hostility, began to say that Inez had insulted her. Looking at Rennie, Inez explained to her that it was her own fault that she took the truth as an insult, and now must apologize for it. But Rennie answered Inez that she would never apologize. Then, with her head held high, Rennie turned sharply and headed towards the exit, without answering Inez. Khalad looked at Inez and asked her if Rennie should not have apologized, but with a smile, Inez replied that this was the norm for Rennie. After all, if Ronnie had apologized, Inez would have felt somehow awkward, but now Ronnie had to understand that she had thrown words to the wind, since for an aristocrat, honor is equivalent to life. But in front of such a crowd, Rennie abandoned her honor, pride, and simply ran away. And when she returns, high society will not forget her act, and Rennie will regret it for the rest of her life. Returning from the duel, Inez asked Khalad if anything had happened to him lately, but Khalad asked not to worry about him. Then, taking Khalad by the hand, Inez wanted to see what would happen in the future. And meanwhile, Khalad repeated that nothing special happened after the fall of the chandelier. Looking at Khalad's tired and exhausted face, Inez realized that everything was not so good, and only then did he admit that he was tormented by nightmares. Hearing this, Inez squeezed his hand harder. Was it all because of that situation with Dihat, she asked? But Khalad denied it. Indeed, on that day, when Inez's carriage stopped abruptly, Dihat Azdian jumped onto the road, who had been specially waiting for Lady Eldrin. Coming out of the carriage, Inez asked Dihat what he wanted from her, and in response, Dihat talked about some kind of invitation, to which Lady Eldrin did not respond. Inem did not understand how the invitation was being discussed most likely. Shaymor simply eliminated his letter. But Dihat's topic changed dramatically, and he was already asking Lady Eldrin about the rumors that Lady Herbert had challenged her to a duel. Without any doubt or shame, Dihat asked Lady Eldrin's permission to become her representative in the duel. Hearing such a proposal, Inez was shocked. Even Shaymor's face changed, realizing that if this happened, the lady would definitely lose. For the sake of decency, Inez decided to ask if Dihat was confident in his abilities. Satisfied and confident, Dihat told the lady that he had long devoted himself to fencing. When suddenly the sound of hooves was heard behind them, it was Khalad who was racing so fast on his horse, noticing Dihat next to Inez. Frightened that this crazy Khalad was not slowing down, Dihat quickly jumped to the side so that he would not be demolished. When Khalad dismounted from his stallion, he held a beautiful bouquet of wildflowers in his hands, as an apology for the fact that Inez had injured her leg because of him on that terrible day. The indignant Dihat began to present to Khalad that he had come out of nowhere and was interfering in their conversation with the beautiful Lady Khalad. Looking at Dihat, did not even want to ask him anything. But Inez told him about the proposal that he wanted to act as a representative. This made Khalad laugh very much, and he asked Dihat how he was going to participate if he didn't really hold a sword in his hands. Dihat immediately began to make excuses by saying that he had joined the fencing club at the academy, but Khalad recalled that after a week of studying, Dihat quit training. This touched Dee's feelings, and he asked Lady Eldrin why she chose this brat, because it is better to choose the person who likes her more, pointing to herself. Looking at the offended Dihat, Inez asked him what he liked so much about her. Scratching his head, Dihat began to list the qualities of Inez, telling her how beautiful, talented, and rich she was, explaining that when he saw her for the first time, he realized that this was exactly his destiny. But Dihat's answer brought back old memories for Inez of countless marriage proposals received from families that were on the verge of bankruptcy. Despite the different contents, the meaning of all the letters was the same. so that she would get married and cover all debts. These letters were sent by the young and beautiful Inez Eldrin, but to all the senders she was just a beautiful product in a store window. Inez hated it all so much that she became rich, and after that even more offers of supposed marriage began to arrive. She understood that if she lost her beauty, her business failed, and she again found herself on the verge of bankruptcy, then no love proposals would come to her. All these memories brought a slight sadness to Inez, so she answered Dihat that she was too good for him. But Dihat did not like this answer, and then he realized that it was all due to the fact that he was not a successor, and began to explain to Lady Eldrin that Khalad was a fake and in the near future. An angry Khalad interrupted Dihat, shouting at him to shut his mouth and not say another word. Smiling, Dihat realized that he had touched Khalad very well and continued talking about succession. Inez, standing on the sidelines, looked at this whole nightmare with a surprised expression on her face. Then, interrupting their argument, Inez explained that it does not matter to her who will lead the Azdian family, be it Khalad or Dihat. Putting her hand on her heart, Inez said that the most important thing for her is the face. She admitted once again that she likes handsome men. Turning around and returning to the carriage, Inez decided to joke with Dihat, telling him that if he became handsome, she would consider his candidacy, and called Khalad to her. And when they got into the carriage, Inez realized that Khalad's position in the family was as difficult as hers, and therefore Inez deliberately did not raise this topic. Inez told Khalad that she did not care one bit about Dihat's words, and that she asked Khalad to become her lover not because of the successor to the family. But this whole situation somehow influenced Khalad, and he decided to tell Inez about why he became the successor to the Azdian family, admitting that he was destined to die instead of Dihat. Inside Inez, everything turned upside down and caught fire with a hot flame. She did not understand what it meant to die instead of Dihat. Then Khalad asked Inez a very simple question, if she knew why he was adopted by the Azdian family. Inez began to reveal information about the Azdian family that was contained in reports and rumors from high society, namely that the Azdian couple did not have an heir. Khalad seemed to agree with this answer, but decided to clarify that for the sake of conceiving a successor, he was adopted. He told in more detail that the adoptive parents had been childless for a long time and therefore decided to turn to a fortune teller, who predicted that if they adopted Khalad, they would be able to conceive a child. And a few years after the adoption, Dihat appeared, which they had dreamed of so much, and Khalad thought that they would abandon him. But everything happened completely differently. The Marquis and the Marquise chose Khalad as their successor, but they still treated him coldly. After some time, Khalad learns the fortune teller's prediction that the heir to the Azdian family will be destined to die young. From what she heard, Inez's palms began to sweat. She looked at Khalad with a sympathetic look, realizing that they did not let Khalad go because they wanted to avoid fate, and used him for the sake of their child. Inez asked Khalad why he couldn't renounce the right of inheritance. Then there might be problems with the knightly order, Khalad said. Inez was on edge. She shouted to Khalad that the prediction was a mistake, and he would live longer than Dihat. Inez decided for herself that now that she was next to him, she would protect him, and prove to everyone that Khalad was more alive than all the living. A few days after this conversation, Inez, sitting in her office, read the news, because after the duel, she began to receive threatening letters from the Herberti family, which Inez then sent to the newspapers. Shamer distracted the lady from reading the newspaper by informing her that the Herberts had again sent a man to get rid of the evidence. But Inez knew that this was only the beginning, and in the future she intended to destroy the Herbert family, but not only the honor of the family, but also the name itself. The more Inez thought about her plan, the more she began to remember everyone from the past, and then she decided to go and unwind. Today was a very important day for Inez because today was the start of sales of Eldrin Cosmetics. Arriving at the store, Inez and Shamor saw a huge line that stretched to the store, and as they passed by, they could not believe their eyes. But suddenly, in the crowd, Inez notices Lachey, and approaching her, he asks why she stands among all the girls. Lachey explained to the lady that because of such a long line, she could not get into the store. Lachey's eyes shone like the most expensive diamond. She told the mistress that they had hit a huge jackpot and she was sure that success awaited them. Inez agreed with Lachey and added that it was her merits and everyone came to see her product. These words gave Lachey even more motivation, and then she decided for herself that she would no longer be afraid and they would handle everything. At that moment, Lachey raised her hand and shouted for everyone to make way for the creator. Chamour stood surprised as everyone parted, and Inez grinned, because according to Lachey, it was impossible to say that she was a brave girl. But if she took out a loan from a private company, then it was brave. The girls in the store looked at all the products and were amazed, because it was the first time they had used something so light, easy to use, and thought that it was a unique product. Inez, meanwhile, watched each admiring girl and thought about already increasing production. But suddenly, Inez noticed two girls who were arguing over her product, deciding who had been standing in line since dawn and who had simply interfered with the purchase. As the head of this entire production, Inez decided to intervene in this small conflict, asking the girls for forgiveness and offering them her advice in choosing a product. Turning around, the girls could not believe their eyes that Mistress Inez Eldrin herself wanted to help them. Without hesitation, the girls agreed. Taking one of the lipsticks, Inez began to tell one of the girls that a light shade would suit her fair skin, and this particular lipstick would look great on her lips. For another girl, Inez chose a different lipstick with a special color that the girl could simply not notice, although the shade of lipstick would go very well with her outfit. The girls immediately took the lipsticks, forgetting about their argument, and Inez was convinced that she definitely needed to take the bull by the horns while there was such a wonderful chance. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the 3rd Nightly Detachment, sitting on a bench, Khalod was polishing the sword, but his demonic blade asked the owner if he often wears this new sword, hinting at resentment. But Khalod was in his own thoughts. He recalled that very day of the duel, when, for the first time, someone smiled at him and kissed him in front of so many people. This was the first time in Khalod's life. Khalod still could not understand why Inez behaved so casually with him. What kind of incomprehensible feelings visited him when she was near? Suddenly, one of his knights appears near Khalod, who is interested in his new sword, saying that he has never seen it before, and concluding that it is very dear to the commander. Without any emotion and in a commanding voice, Khalod replied that it was a gift from his beloved. Hearing such an answer, all the knights stopped what they were doing and went straight to the commander. Everyone wanted to look at this beautiful sword given to their beloved. Showing it to everyone, Khalod thought that earlier Inez bought him clothes, this time gave him a beautiful sword, and it turned out that he always only receives gifts. Then Khalod decided to ask his knights for advice on what they usually give to their lovers, because this was also the first time in his life. One of his charges offered to give her something she liked. Khalod immediately presented Inez in all her best jewelry, realizing that giving money to Lady Inez as a gift was not the best idea. Khalod's sword supported his idea of a gift, telling him that if he continued to be shameless, the Brulik would abandon them. Meanwhile, the knights could not get enough of the fact that the day had finally arrived when their commander asked for love advice. But the whole gathering was interrupted by a messenger. He informed Khalod that an order had arrived from His Excellency Helios, who demanded that the slave traders be eliminated. Slavery is illegal in the Benzian Empire, but slave traders are secretly operating in the country the 3rd Detachment, together with Khalod, has been tracking them for a long time, but it was never possible to obtain information about their base. Commander-in-Chief Helios finally gave the order to arrest the slave traders. Khalod ordered the 5 to remain in the palace. Everyone else will follow with him. They headed to the horses to set off. Having reached their destination, Khalod said that he and Nimus would take care of the slaves, and ordered the rest to cordon off the area so that no one would escape. Knocking on the huge doors, someone from the other side asked who came to them. Pretending, Khalod answered the question that he wanted to plant peonies for them. The doors immediately opened, and Khalod and Nimus followed inside. The man who met them told them not to rush, since all the slaves were already here, and they should inspect each one. Khalod clarified whether all the slaves were here or if they were somewhere else. The man began to giggle and say that, of course, everything is here and only here. They can find such strong guys. Suddenly, Khalod was right behind the man, and his eyes widened as if he sensed something. Yes, right from behind, the man received a fatal blow from Khalod and fell to the ground. Together with Nemus, they took the keys to the dungeons from this dead poor fellow. Starting to open the doors with the keys, behind them were small, exhausted children who were considered slaves. Kalod told them all to go outside. The poor, exhausted boy looked with his teary eyes in bewilderment as to what this man was talking about, what exit they were being called to. And then Khaled said in a quiet, languid voice, "It's time to return home." The children, scared to death, began to ask whether they were going to be sold, to which Khaled replied that it was not about selling at all, but about rescuing them from this monstrous place. The children's eyes were filled with great hope and a desire to return home as quickly as possible from this terrible life. Khaled ordered his assistant to take the children and leave first, but for some reason he called out to him, "Commander." He wanted to look around, to which Khaled gave the go-ahead and told him to immediately send the guys who were waiting outside. The assistant accepted the commander's order. Walking towards the exit, Khaled began to think, why, looking at these children, does he see himself in them, as if this is a feeling of some kind of déjà vu? There was definitely a distinct feeling that he was very familiar with this place. Dropping to one knee, Khaled held his head, as if he had begun to vividly remember something and was feeling sick from these thoughts. If only he could meet him again, he would give his life. He did not understand what these memories were and whose voice he began to hear in his head. When he just managed to pull out the demonic blade, a certain figure appears before us, turned towards the wall. The blonde man began to talk about how the time has come. The guy who appeared behind him said, "Your Holiness, let's take a look at the sacred tree." They headed somewhere along the corridor. The guy and His Holiness approached a very large and powerful tree, which was considered sacred. Waving his hand up, the voice said that there would be a drought in the south. This voice and the blonde man was the high priest of the great temple, Pernail. The priest can predict the future with the help of the sacred tree, but people consider him special, not only because he is a prophet. Pernail is a person whose soul and memories continue to live even after death. He continues his legacy. He is a man who remembers the history of the continent, and a sage who sees the future. There was always only one high priest, and he was always Pernail. Here he had already freed everyone after a certain ritual, but asked the priest to remain. Pernail asked if the priest who was sent to the emperor's name day had returned, to which the guy replied that he had returned this morning. The priest clarified what that priest said. The priest reported that the owner of the demonic blade was fine. He watched the owner for several days, but did not notice anything unusual, which seemed strange to Pernail. Perhaps his memory had not returned yet. By now, he should have already remembered his past life. Apparently, he had not yet met a real opponent. It seemed to the priest that this was causing a lot of problems. The sacred tree continues to dry out every day, so the prophecies become very blurry. The priest informed the priest about the rumors going around that the owner of the demonic blade had become engaged. He asked him to tell him more, and he shared that they say that he is dating the eldest granddaughter of the Earl of Eldrin, Ines Eldrin. The priest asked, "Ines Eldrin, that famous investor, owner of the demonic blade and investor, interesting." The priest said that he would like to leave for a while. He wanted to meet with Ines Eldrin. The cosmetics business is booming. Sales of the limited edition with her signature are also good, increasing 100-fold in an instant. It seems that Ine even began to think about a new business. However, implementing large-scale projects remains difficult. Influential families already control industries such as shipping and construction. In addition, the trading industry has been taken over by the Gilbert family. There is no need to point your finger at the sky. You need to be careful when choosing your next business. Inez asked for a newspaper to read what was written in the economic column. After studying the newspaper, something seemed to confuse her. In one of the columns, it was written that Inez was having a secret affair with Jayard Hoffman. Is it really even possible that the weeklies write about this? Shaymore began to say that, in fact, letters from Jayard arrived every day and she used to sort them, but lately there had been more of them, and she felt that she should mention it. Jayard Hoffman, the eldest son of Count Hoffman, the owner of a grocery store, met Mrs. Inez the year before last. The lady had a business meeting with the Count, to which Jayard also came. He must have fallen in love with Inez at first sight. And since then, he has been persistently sending her letters, and since last year he has offered her his hand and heart. Of course, the lady continued to refuse, but from time to time the lady is inundated with marriage proposals. But this bastard knows no bounds. There were times when men would spread ridiculous rumors about an affair, or pretend to be her lover. But this stalker is driving me crazy. Inez even thought that maybe he should be killed. Shamor said that it could be done so that there would be no traces left at all. She was seriously angry and didn't even understand that Inez was just joking. Shamor may be harsh in her language, but they really need to do something about this. After Inez found out about the letters, it seems that he was also the one who sent those suspicious gifts. She hoped that at least today everything would be okay. Today is a date and her lover is a knight commander, a trustworthy man, and if everything goes well, she can kill 2 birds with 2 stones. Well, how handsome this man is. Just look at those sparkling eyes and charming hair. He has already come on a date with Inez. Inez noticed his tired appearance and asked what was wrong, to which Khaled replied that he could not sleep. Was he having a nightmare again? Inez was thinking about what the hell dreams he was having, since he had no face at all. He asked her not to worry, but how could she not worry if her lover looked so tortured? If this continues, the plan will fail because of his health problems and not because the demonic sword gets out of control. Inez said that she would like to watch the play and asked if Khaled would mind. He reacted rather embarrassedly, to which Inez thought that maybe he didn't want to which he said that he had never even gone to performances. Inez said that today was a great opportunity to go to the play with her. Arriving at the theater, they began to look for their seats. Coming closer to their seats, someone passing by said, "Die." Having already seen their places, the seat was cut crosswise. Khaled was shocked and said that he would ask the staff to change their seats. Inez said that the performance was about to start, which meant that there would be no seats in the stalls. There is no way out, and they decided to go to the box. The stage was beautifully illuminated. The actors had already begun their performance. Inez looked at Khaled and thought that even commoners went to the theater, and apparently the Asdian couple never took Khaled to a performance. He was as focused as a cat looking at a fish in an aquarium, and his hand was squeezing so tightly. And then, Inez carefully and tenderly touched Khaled's hand with her refined hand. He immediately turned to Inez in bewilderment, and Inez called him cutie. It was so cute and romantic to watch them. However, Khaled did not remove his hand from her. The actress played the role perfectly on this bright stage. Excellent lighting was provided by an equally beautiful chandelier. Oh no, it can't be! The bolts from the chandelier seem to have started to break off. There was wild horror and fear in the eyes of Inez and Khaled. Screams were heard all around. A representative of the theater came on stage and bowed, apologizing for the situation with the lighting equipment. Since the situation was terrible, he said that the performance must be stopped and a refund could be obtained at the box office. The lady immediately turned to the side. She has not yet seen such incidents, and while she is with him, something strange often happens, but today's event is the work of human hands, as if someone is deliberately trying to ruin their date. Perhaps this same stalker is watching them. Coming out of the theater, Khaled said that at first it seemed to him that the chairs were torn because of his misfortune, but something was haunting him. He told Inez that he had recently received several anonymous letters containing curses and death wishes. Inez was surprised that he didn't say anything about it, to which Khaled replied that this happens quite often. Inez was sure that he did not attach much importance to the letters, but letters threatening him and her love letters were definitely a stalker. She immediately decided to tell him about it. Khaled asked if this meant that they should immediately catch him in such a case. Inez believed that if the stalker understood their intentions, he would immediately run away. They decided to lure him and wait for the right moment. Inez and Khaled went to have lunch at one of the local establishments, where they were greeted with great joy. The owner clarified whether he correctly understood that her lover came with Inez, to which she answered with a firm yes. The man said that in this case he would have to try harder than usual. Sitting down at the table, Inez began to tell me that she used to often come here with Halo when they had no money, and it's so delicious that she remembers this place even after she's earned a fortune. Khaled looked at Inez with a kind of cold gaze, which made Inez think that something was wrong. Maybe he thinks that she's going to remember the past next to him. His gaze seemed to encourage him to continue this topic, as if he were saying, "Continue, I'm listening." He even seemed quite attentive to Inez. Inez knew about his past, but he knew nothing about her past. She shared that after the divorce, the situation worsened, and now she makes good money, but a couple of years ago, everything was completely different. She saved every penny, and trips to the restaurant happened only on special occasions. He asked if she had the ability to see misfortune then. Inez replied that she was, and she suffered a lot because of her, and she never talked about it. She gained the ability when she was only 10 years old, having only seen minor misfortunes as a child. Her father took her words as nonsense, and her mother laughed at her. And no matter how much she tried to tell her mother about the upcoming misfortunes, her mother considered it all stupidity or a coincidence. And so it was until Inez told her mother about that very misfortune. The father is with another woman, and since then, life has been turned upside down. The father kicked the mother out of the house, and the Marquise took her and Hilo into his care. When her mother was dying, she asked Inez to keep her ability a secret so that bad people couldn't take advantage of it. Inez tried to keep her promise, but after the death of her mother, she had no choice but to resort to her ability. She couldn't lose the rest of her family, and sometimes she regrets it, thinking that she should have started using power earlier. Perhaps then she would be able to protect her mother. To which Khaled said that this was the best option. Khaled said that he himself still regrets some things to this day. For example, the day when he took the demonic blade, and at that moment that same stalker appeared behind him. The stalker they talked about earlier came to the same restaurant. Since he followed them all the way, it means he doesn't know that they noticed him. It would be extremely awkward to turn his head and meet his gaze. Inez asked Khaled to describe to her the man sitting behind her. As expected, it was the same Jared Hoffman. There was an idea to detain him right now. But you can't waste such food, and you need to eat first and then decide. The owner approached the stalker to take the order, at the very moment when he was burning with curiosity about what the lady and her lover were whispering about. Inez and Khaled had already brought dishes for their dinner. The lady enjoyed this delicious cuisine as usual. She immediately brought her fork with a piece of duck to feed Khaled herself, as in the most romantic stories. She wanted to see the reaction of that table to these actions. Well, what love and romance between this couple? The lady immediately asked Khaled to take care of her in the same way and feed her from his fork. All these mercies infuriated the stalker even more. After a few hours of a wonderful dinner for the couple in love, they were about to leave. The stalker again followed directly in the couple's footsteps. Inez carefully turned around to see him in her peripheral vision. Khaled also noticed the stalker approaching from behind. Lady and Khaled followed to the embankment to lure Jaylard. Approaching a little more, Khaled sharply grabbed the stalker by the hand and asked why he continued to pursue them. To which Jaylard fearfully replied that he was just passing by chance. What nonsense! By chance from the theater itself. The stalker began to ask Inez for help so that she would tell Khaled that she knew him and everything was fine. She really didn't want to touch him, but she needed to see him suffer. She saw that he was furious because it didn't work out the way he wanted to bribe a man in the theater, and they didn't interrupt the date. They also caught him. Jaylard began to make very ridiculous excuses, trying to string words together, but he just couldn't do it. Falling to his knees in front of them, the stalker told Inez that he loved her. He continued that even though she never answered his letters, meeting such a monster is inexplicable. Stalker said he felt sick when he heard the news. He started shouting that he was just there to talk, and they called him a stalker. Khaled immediately grabbed the scoundrel by the collar. Khaled knows bastards like Jaylard. They all come to their senses after they get punched in the face. Raising the bastard above the water, the stalker immediately began to squeak that he understood everything and he would never approach them again. Inez asked to stop. Khaled threw him to the ground and said that he hoped that this would never happen again. Taking the blade, he said, "If this happens again, he will kill him without thinking, right on the spot." A more radical approach than we had anticipated, Khaled pointedly plunged his blade into the ground, right between Jayard's legs. Khaled asked the lady if he had gone too far, to which she replied that he had not, and that she even liked it. Inez thanked her lover. If it weren't for him, this guy definitely wouldn't have given her a quiet life. He replied that he was simply doing his duty, as stated in the contract. In a contractual relationship in which everything seemed to be going according to Inez's plans. Minor feelings and a great misfortune that she could not notice. The estate of the Marquise of Asdian was engulfed in flames. Everyone around was shouting, "Bring water," and the flame continued to flare up, and then the screams changed to those that sounded, that it was all because of him, and call Khaled as soon as possible. What will happen in the next chapters? We will find out very soon.